There is a particular kind of man who is impossible to like and impossible to ignore. A man who walks into a room and immediately begins rearranging it. Not because he was asked, not because it was polite, but because he had already decided, somewhere between the door and the first chair, that the room was wrong, that the people in it were wrong, that the entire arrangement of things needed correcting, and that he was the one to correct it. Bernard Law Montgomery was that man. He was not charming in the way that great men are often described as charming. He did not put you at ease. He did not laugh easily, or suffer fools graciously, or pretend that your opinion mattered when he had already formed his own. He was, by almost every account from those who served beside him, an acquired taste, and many never quite acquired it. His own officers sometimes despised him. His American allies found him insufferable. Even Winston Churchill, who needed him desperately and knew it, spent considerable private energy managing the friction that Montgomery generated simply by being Montgomery. And yet, when the British Army was broken, when its back was against the Mediterranean and its soldiers had been retreating for so long that retreat had begun to feel like doctrine, when the war in North Africa had eaten through one British general after another and the desert itself seemed to belong to the Germans, they sent for this man. This difficult, abrasive, self-certain man with his beret and his 2 cap badges and his habit of going to bed at 9:30 in the evening. And he arrived, and he looked at what he had inherited, and he told the Eighth Army, told them clearly, without ceremony or equivocation, that the retreating was finished, that they would not be pulling back 1 more meter, that they were going to win. It sounded to many ears like the speech of a fool or a lunatic. It was, in fact, the speech of the only man in the British Army who believed it completely, prepared for it completely, and had the discipline to make it true. This is the complete history of Bernard Montgomery, and it is a story that rewards patience, because Montgomery himself rewarded patience. He is not a figure who reveals himself in a single dramatic gesture or a single celebrated battle. He is a figure who accumulates, who makes sense slowly, the way a long campaign makes sense, only when you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. What follows is that whole shape, from a strict and lonely childhood in the north of Ireland to the commanding heights of Allied strategy in the Second World War, from a junior officer who was nearly killed in the mud of France to the man who accepted Germany's unconditional surrender on a windswept heath in Northern Europe, from a figure of ridicule in certain Allied headquarters to a figure of genuine, grudging, undeniable historical weight. We will not be making a saint of him. Montgomery was not a saint. He was vain in ways that went beyond ordinary pride, difficult in ways that went beyond ordinary confidence, and wrong, sometimes expensively wrong, in ways that cost lives and campaigns, and the goodwill of allies the British could not afford to lose. The controversy that surrounds him is not invented by critics or manufactured by rivalry. It is earned. It is part of him, and a documentary that smoothed it away would be a lie dressed up as a tribute. But we will also not be making a villain of him, because that would be equally dishonest. The man who stood before the Eighth Army in August of 1942 and promised them victory was not performing. He was not managing morale with calculated theater, though he understood theater well enough. He believed it. And because he believed it, and because his belief was built on something more durable than optimism, built on obsessive preparation and merciless self-discipline and a lifetime of thinking about war more carefully than almost anyone around him, his soldiers began to believe it too. That is not a small thing. In a war of the scale and horror of the Second World War, the belief of ordinary soldiers that they might actually survive and win is not a footnote. It is everything. So settle in. Pour something warm. This is one of those histories that takes its time, because the life it is tracing took its time. Montgomery did not burst onto the world stage. He accumulated, over decades, through disappointment and obscurity and personal tragedy, and the slow, grinding education of a professional soldier who refused to stop thinking. By the time the world was ready for what he had to offer, He had been preparing it for more than 30 years. There is something almost novelistic about that, about a man who spends his entire youth and middle age being told by institutions, by superiors, by the military culture around him, that he is too difficult, too unconventional, too certain of his own correctness to be truly great. And then the greatest war in human history arrives, and suddenly his particular brand of certainty is exactly what is required. Suddenly the difficult man is indispensable. Suddenly the room arranges itself around him. We will follow him through all of it. The childhood shaped by a distant father and a formidable mother, the wounding on the Somme that might have killed a less stubborn man, the quiet years of interwar soldiering in which he quietly remade himself into something new, the personal grief that stripped away everything soft and left only iron, the early command in the disaster of France in 1940, where chaos gave him room to demonstrate what calm leadership actually looked like, and then the desert, and then Normandy, and then the long, bruising, alliance-straining push into the heart of Germany, where Montgomery fought on two fronts simultaneously, one against the Wehrmacht and one against the growing impatience of an Allied command structure that was increasingly American, increasingly powerful, and increasingly convinced that Bernard Montgomery's careful, methodical, deeply British way of waging war was simply too slow for the age. He would argue, until the end of his life, that they were wrong. The argument is still unresolved. Historians still fight over Arnhem, over Falaise, over the broad front versus the single thrust, over whether his caution saved lives or prolonged the war, over whether his ego was a weapon or a liability or both at once. If you have been watching documentaries like this one for any length of time, you know that the questions which do not resolve are often the most interesting ones. They are the questions worth sitting with. So sit with this one. If you are new to this channel and this is the documentary that found you, welcome. Consider subscribing. There is a great deal more history where this came from, and we tell it this way, slowly, carefully, with respect for the complexity of the people inside it. And if you have been here before, then you already know what this is. Put the phone down. Let the night settle around you. We are going back a long way, to a boy in a cold house in the north of Ireland who was already, somehow, absolutely certain that he was right. His name was Bernard Montgomery, and this is his complete history. The island of Ireland sits at the western edge of Europe, where the Atlantic pushes cold gray water against ancient stone, and where the wind carries something permanent and unforgiving in its voice. It was here, in the small coastal town of Moville, on the western shore of Lough Foyle in County Donegal, that Bernard Law Montgomery came into the world on the 17th of November, 1887. He was the fourth of 9 children born to Henry Montgomery, an Anglican bishop of considerable standing, and Maud Farrar, a woman of fierce domestic authority, whose force of will would shape every child beneath her roof, in ways both visible and invisible. The house they kept was ordered, demanding, and deeply religious, a household where discipline was not merely enforced but considered a form of holiness, and where weakness of any kind drew quiet but unmistakable disapproval. Bernard was, from the beginning, a difficult fit. He was restless, combative, stubborn in ways that shaded toward compulsive, and possessed of an energy that could not be contained within the rhythms of scripture and propriety. In a family structured around grace and deference, he was constitutionally incapable of either. His mother Maud was the dominant force in his early life, and not a gentle one, where his father Henry was measured and thoughtful, shaped by the pastoral concerns of a bishop who moved between congregations and committees. Maud was sharp, immediate, and relentlessly focused on order. She managed 9 children with something close to military efficiency, and she did not bend easily toward sentiment. Bernard would later describe his childhood in terms that unsettled those who heard them, not with warmth or nostalgia, but with a clinical acknowledgement of distance and conflict. He did not feel loved in the way that other children might have felt loved. He felt governed, That distinction, absorbed into his bones during his earliest years, would leave a permanent mark on every relationship he formed for the rest of his life. He learned early that approval had to be earned through performance, and that the cost of failure was not comfort, but correction. The move from Donegal to Tasmania came when Bernard was still very young, when his father was appointed Bishop of Tasmania, and the entire family relocated to the Southern Hemisphere. For a child already struggling to find his footing, the upheaval was considerable. Australia in the 1890s was raw and expansive, a place that operated by its own rules and offered both freedom and harshness in generous proportion. Bernard took to the outdoor life with characteristic intensity. He was competitive, athletic, and constitutionally unable to accept being bested at anything physical. But the distance from England, from the institutions that shaped the class to which the Montgomerys belonged, also meant a kind of social limbo. He was neither fully colonial nor fully English, and the identity he was building had gaps in it that no amount of athletic effort could fill. The years in Tasmania were formative precisely because they were unsettled, because they forced a child with no natural gift for placidity to develop other tools: calculation, persistence, the willingness to outlast discomfort through sheer stubbornness. When the family finally returned to England, settling in the county of Surrey in the years approaching the turn of the century, Bernard encountered a new set of pressures. Surrey was ordered and respectable, the kind of English county where the hedgerows were kept and the social gradations were understood without being spoken. The Montgomery children were enrolled in schools, integrated into the structured rhythms of English middle-class life, and measured against expectations that had a specifically English shape. Bernard was not an easy student in the conventional sense. He was not a boy who absorbed knowledge through quiet attention and obedience. He learned through confrontation, through challenge, through the friction of resistance. Teachers who expected compliance found him maddening. Those who engaged him as an adversary occasionally found him brilliant. The balance between the two was always uncertain. His admission to St. Paul's School in London marked a significant step in his formation. St. Paul's was not one of the great aristocratic public schools. It was not Eton or Harrow, and it did not carry the social weight of the institutions that produced the generals and cabinet ministers of an earlier generation. It was, instead, a school for the clever sons of professional England, a place where merit counted for something alongside breeding, where intellectual rigor was taken seriously as a preparation for the world's demands. For Bernard, this was not entirely comfortable territory. He was athletic before he was scholarly, aggressive before he was analytical, and the culture of the school rewarded a kind of disciplined intelligence that he had not yet fully developed. But St. Paul's did something for him that aristocratic ease never could have. It forced him to compete on ground that was not tilted in his favor, and competition, in any form, was the element in which he most naturally thrived. He threw himself into sport with the same ferocious concentration he would later bring to battle planning. Cricket, football, and later the brutally physical demands of the school's athletic culture became for him not recreation but preparation, not play but rehearsal for something he could not yet name. He was not reflective about this. He did not sit with books and wonder about the shape his life might take. He acted, he competed, he led, he fell out badly with authority on a number of occasions, and he maintained throughout a quality that his contemporaries noticed and could not quite categorize, an absolute certainty about his own eventual importance that had no basis yet in any demonstrated achievement. It was not arrogance in the ordinary sense. It was something stranger and more durable, a complete internal conviction that his life would amount to something, held like a compass bearing against all external evidence to the contrary. The question of what specifically that life would amount to was answered not through long deliberation, but through the practical logic of a family with limited resources and a son who needed direction. A military career offered structure, status, and a profession in which the qualities Bernard had demonstrated, Aggression, competitiveness, the instinct for command could be channeled into something socially recognized and financially sustainable. The army also offered a clear hierarchy within which advancement was theoretically tied to demonstrated competence, though the reality of British military culture in the early 20th century was considerably more complex, more tangled with class and connection than the formal structure suggested. Bernard Montgomery, son of a bishop, educated at a school that was good but not gilded, would spend considerable portions of his career navigating a world that had not been designed with him in mind. His admission to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst in 1908 placed him at the threshold of that world. Sandhurst shaped the officers of the British Army. It provided the foundations of military knowledge, the rituals of regimental culture, and the social conditioning that was expected to produce gentlemen who could lead men under fire. For many of its intake, Sandhurst was a continuation of a life already defined by privilege and expectation. For Montgomery, it was something else, an institution to be mastered, a system to be understood from the inside, a structure that could be used rather than simply inhabited. He was not comfortable in the easy, unexamined way that money and social assurance made comfortable. He was competitive, calculating, and intent. His time at Sandhurst was not without difficulty. There is on record an incident during his cadet years, the details of which have never been fully suppressed despite their unflattering content, in which his physical aggression toward a fellow cadet crossed lines that the institution considered serious. The consequences were significant enough to threaten his career before it had properly begun, and the episode revealed something important about the young Montgomery, that his will to dominate was not yet disciplined by the judgment that would eventually make it formidable. He was raw force without sufficient restraint, a quality that was dangerous in a cadet and could be catastrophic in an officer. The fact that he recovered, that he graduated, that the incident became a chapter rather than the whole story, says something about both the institution's tolerance and his own absolute refusal to accept permanent defeat. He graduated from Sandhurst and was commissioned into the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, not the most fashionable of choices, not the regiment that would have attracted the young men of Eton or the cavalry officers whose families had maintained the same regimental connections across generations. It was a solid, professional infantry regiment, and it was his. The commission was not handed to him by inheritance or connection. It was earned through competition in an institution that, for all its class inflections, ultimately required its graduates to perform to a standard. That standard Montgomery had met. He had done so not through grace or ease or the social lubrication that made everything smoother for those born into the right circumstances, but through a concentration of effort and will that was, even at this early stage, something beyond the ordinary. What drove him, what had always driven him, was not entirely clear even to those who knew him well in these early years. His faith, such as it was, operated at a remove from the institutional Anglicanism of his father's household. His relationships were formal, bounded, and rarely intimate. His pleasures were almost entirely competitive. He was not a man who seemed to hunger for beauty or comfort or the warmth of easy company. He hungered for mastery. He wanted to understand systems completely, to be certain before he acted, to never be caught unprepared. These were qualities that would have seemed, to the more traditionally minded officers around him, slightly excessive, a little too earnest, a little too intense, insufficiently relaxed about the whole enterprise of soldiering. The British military establishment of the early 20th century had its own culture, its own sense of how an officer should carry himself, and effortless ease was part of that culture in ways that Montgomery could not manufacture. That inability to manufacture ease would cost him socially for the rest of his career, but it would also save the lives of men not yet born, in battles not yet imagined, on ground that no British officer had yet walked. The boy who had never been comfortable, in Donegal or Tasmania, in Surrey or St. Paul's, in the carefully graded social world of Sandhurst, was becoming something that the British Army had not entirely prepared itself to receive. He was not what the institution expected. He was something the institution needed, He was barely 20 years old when he first left England behind. The troopship carried him south and east, through waters that grew warmer by the day, toward a posting that would introduce him to empire in its most practical and unglamorous form. Egypt, in 1910, was a place of immense distances, grinding heat, and a colonial administration that had long since settled into comfortable routine. The British Army garrison there was professional in its way, but it operated according to assumptions inherited from the Victorian age, assumptions about hierarchy, about the natural order of military command, about what soldiers were for, and what they could reasonably be expected to endure. Montgomery arrived with Sandhurst training still fresh in his muscles and his mind, and he watched everything with the attentive, slightly unsettling focus that had already begun to mark him as different from his peers. He was not romantic about empire, not the way some young officers were. What interested him was the machinery of it, how units moved, how orders were communicated, how men responded when conditions deteriorated and comfort became a memory. The garrison duty itself was not spectacular work. Montgomery served with the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, learning the rhythms of colonial soldiering, the drills, the inspections, the slow accumulation of small professional knowledge that never quite felt urgent because the peace stretched on, seemingly without limit. Yet even within that apparent stillness, he was accumulating something. He studied the terrain of military organization with the same methodical hunger he had brought to everything since his schoolboy years at St. Paul's. He noticed which officers prepared thoroughly and which ones improvised, and he noticed, with a judgment that was already maturing into something harder than mere opinion, which approach produced better results when anything unexpected occurred. Egypt gave him his first sustained experience of commanding men in conditions that were foreign and physically demanding, and it confirmed something he had begun to sense at Sandhurst, that good leadership was not an inheritance or a social gift. It was a discipline, and it could be taught. Then the world changed. By the summer of 1914, the European alliance system had pulled every major power into a catastrophe that none of them had fully imagined, and none of them could immediately control. Montgomery was 26 years old when Britain declared war on Germany in August of that year, a lieutenant with colonial service behind him and no experience of anything resembling the industrialized slaughter that was already beginning to take shape along the Franco-Belgian frontier. The Royal Warwickshire Regiment was mobilized and transported to France as part of the British Expeditionary Force, and within weeks Montgomery was confronting a reality that bore almost no resemblance to the wars his military education had prepared him for. The scale was different, the noise was different, and the institutional relationship between command and consequence, between the decisions made in headquarters and the deaths suffered in the forward lines, was different in ways that would take him years to fully process. He distinguished himself almost immediately. At a village in Flanders in the autumn of 1914, leading his platoon in the kind of close-quarters infantry fighting that the Western Front had not yet calcified into fixed trench positions, Montgomery charged directly toward an enemy position, was credited with personal courage of a high order, and was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. He was 26 years old and had shown, under genuine pressure and in genuine danger, that he could move toward the enemy while other men hesitated. The award was not a small thing. It marked him, in the institutional language of the British Army, as an officer of uncommon promise. But it also told him something about himself that mattered beyond the decoration. He did not freeze when the situation became lethal, and he did not lose his ability to think clearly when the noise and confusion of combat pressed in from every direction. The injury came later, and it came close to killing him. The fighting on the Somme in 1916 was among the most devastating episodes in the history of British arms, a sustained offensive that consumed lives in numbers so enormous that the military and political establishment struggled to account for them in any way that preserved coherent meaning. Montgomery was caught in the fighting, shot through the chest by a sniper, and left in the open, badly wounded, for a period that in later accounts he recalled with the controlled understatement of a man who had decided some time ago that drama required no embellishment. He was eventually brought out. He recovered, slowly, but the experience of being wounded severely in a campaign that had produced catastrophic results for objectives that seemed, at the time and afterward, grossly disproportionate to the cost. That experience lodged in him like a second wound that never properly healed. What the Somme gave Montgomery, beyond the physical reality of near death, was a framework for criticism that he would spend the rest of his career elaborating. The generals who had ordered those attacks were not villains in his analysis. He was not that simple. But they had operated according to methods that were inadequate to the scale and complexity of the problem they faced, and the price of that inadequacy had been paid entirely by the men at the front. He had seen the plans, or enough of them to understand how optimistic they were. He had seen the gap between what was promised in orders and what was possible in the mud and wire of no man's land. And he had concluded, with a clarity that would harden over the following decades into absolute conviction, that the fundamental failure of the British Army's high command was a failure of systematic thought. They had not planned carefully enough. They had not coordinated well enough. They had not preserved the lives of their men with the seriousness that the enterprise demanded. He came back from his wounds to staff appointments, which suited the direction his thinking was already taking. Staff work, the coordination of logistics, the translation of strategic intention into operational instruction, required precisely the kind of systematic rigor that Montgomery believed modern warfare demanded. He was good at it, and he knew he was good at it, and that knowledge produced in him not confidence exactly, but a kind of accelerating certainty about the right way to approach military problems. He worked under senior officers who noticed his ability, but sometimes found his manner abrasive. He had little patience for imprecision, less for social performance that served no military purpose, and none at all for the comfortable assumption that things would work out if the right people were in charge. Things worked out when the right planning was in place. He had seen the alternative. Palestine offered a different kind of military education. By the later years of the war, Montgomery had moved from the static horror of the Western Front to the more fluid operations in the Middle East, where cavalry still moved across open ground, and the relationship between maneuver and terrain took on different characteristics than the grinding attrition of Flanders and France. He observed commanders who were managing mobile warfare with varying degrees of skill, and he brought the same analytical eye to this environment that he had brought to everything else. The contrast was instructive. Here, when coordination failed, the consequences were visible in a different way. Not always in mass casualties, but in missed opportunities, in enemy forces that escaped when they might have been destroyed, in objectives that remained uncaptured because the preparation had been insufficient. Montgomery filed it all away. He was building, through experience rather than theory alone, a doctrine of warfare that would eventually bear his name. By the time the armistice came in November of 1918, Montgomery had been through 4 years of war that had destroyed the professional certainties of an entire generation of British officers. Many of his contemporaries emerged from that experience exhausted, grateful to be alive, and inclined to hope that nothing like it would be necessary again. Montgomery emerged with different conclusions. He was grateful to be alive, that much, surely. But he was also convinced, more deeply than ever, that the military failures of the war had been failures of professional method, not failures of courage. The men had been brave. The junior officers had been brave. What had often been missing was systematic thinking at every level of command, and a genuine institutional commitment to the preservation of soldiers' lives as a strategic priority rather than an optional consideration. That conviction, unfashionable in the 1920s, unwelcome in some quarters of a military establishment that preferred to believe the war had been lost, not through planning failures, but through impossible circumstances, became the engine of everything that followed. Montgomery did not keep his conclusions private. He wrote about them, lectured about them, argued about them with the relentless energy of a man who had decided that being thought difficult was a price worth paying if the alternative was silence about things that mattered. He had served in Egypt, on the Somme, in Flanders, in Palestine. He had been decorated, badly wounded, promoted. He had watched men die in badly coordinated attacks and watched other men survive because someone had thought carefully enough about the problem before sending them forward. The evidence was not ambiguous to him. It never had been. What the First World War made of Bernard Montgomery was, in a sense, the military thinker he had always been becoming. The structures were there from childhood, the discipline, the obsessive attention, the refusal to accept imprecision as inevitable. But war had given those structures a moral weight that peacetime could not have provided. The dead on the Somme were not an abstraction to him. They were men he had known or served alongside, men lost not to superior enemy skill, but to institutional habits that he was determined, for the rest of his career, to replace with something better. That determination would take him through the interwar years, with a ferocity that often made him difficult to work with, difficult to promote, and impossible to ignore. The war was over. The guns had gone quiet across the shattered fields of France and Palestine, and the men who had survived them were streaming home to a Britain that barely knew what to do with them. For Bernard Montgomery, peace was not relief. It was a problem to be solved. He had watched too many soldiers die for reasons that had nothing to do with courage, reasons that had everything to do with confusion, poor communication, and commanders who treated the battlefield like a gentleman's morning ride. He returned to the army not as a man at rest, but as a man with something to prove, carrying the weight of what he had witnessed and the burning certainty that it must never happen again. The peacetime army was a quiet institution, conservative by temperament, and deeply suspicious of officers who pushed too hard or thought too loudly. Montgomery was about to become exactly that kind of officer. His immediate post-war years were spent moving through a succession of staff appointments and regimental postings that would have dulled a less driven man into comfortable obscurity. He served with his regiment in Ireland and then in England, accumulating the paperwork experience that the British Army considered the proper ladder to advancement. But Montgomery was never simply accumulating. He was watching, dissecting, and cataloging every institutional failure he encountered. He attended the Staff College at Camberley in 1920, and where other officers saw a prestigious finishing school for careers, he saw a laboratory, a place where assumptions could be tested and, where they failed the test, discarded. His instructors found him sharp and sometimes exasperating. His fellow students found him intense, occasionally brilliant, and not always easy to share a mess with. He had no patience for vagueness, no tolerance for officers who dressed their ignorance in confident language, and absolutely no interest in pretending otherwise. By the mid-1920s, Montgomery had returned to Camberley, this time as an instructor, and the difference between the student he had been and the teacher he became was telling. He did not simply deliver the received wisdom of British military doctrine. He interrogated it. He pressed his students to think about problems from first principles. What was the objective? What were the resources? How would the enemy respond? And how would you communicate the plan to the man who had to carry it out under fire? These were not revolutionary questions on their face. But in a culture that valued the capable amateur and distrusted the clinical thinker, asking them insistently and repeatedly was itself a kind of provocation. Montgomery believed that clarity was not an optional refinement in military orders. It was the difference between men living and men dying. He wrote this into everything he taught, and he wrote it plainly, without the elaborate hedging that decorated so much official military prose. Alongside his intellectual work, he became increasingly preoccupied with the physical condition of officers and soldiers alike. This was not a fashionable concern in a peacetime army still shaped by the assumptions of an earlier century, where fitness was assumed to belong to the rank and file, and the officer class was expected to be vigorous in spirit, if not always in body. Montgomery disagreed vigorously. He believed that physical fitness was inseparable from mental sharpness, that a tired body produced a foggy mind, and a foggy mind in command was a death sentence for the men below it. He ran, he walked, he imposed exercise regimes, and he expected the officers he trained to meet a standard that some of them regarded as frankly excessive. A few resented it. More of them, in time, came to recognize that he was right, even if they would have preferred to reach that conclusion at a slightly more relaxed pace. It was during these years that Montgomery also began to develop his distinctive philosophy of officer leadership, not the charismatic, instinct-driven model celebrated in memoirs and regimental histories, but something more rigorous, more systematic, and in some ways more demanding. He believed that great leadership was not a gift. It was a skill constructed through study, self-discipline, and ruthless clarity about one's own weaknesses. A commander who relied on flair might win once. A commander who had built a reliable system of thinking and communicating would win consistently and, more importantly, would bring his men through alive. This idea placed him in quiet but persistent tension with an establishment that preferred to believe great generals were born rather than made. Montgomery was not interested in being politely quiet about the distinction. Then, in 1927, something happened that none of Montgomery's professional calculations had prepared him for. He met Betty Carver, a widow with 2 young sons, vivid and warm-spirited in a way that stood in sharp contrast to the angular certainties of his professional life. Their courtship was brief by the standards of careful men, and their marriage, which came that same year, surprised those who had written Montgomery off as a man too consumed by military purpose to accommodate personal life. Betty brought something into his world that the Army had never provided: a domestic anchor, genuine warmth, and the kind of uncomplicated human connection that had been absent from his experience since childhood. He was, by many accounts, genuinely happy, an emotion that did not always sit easily on a man who had made a discipline of emotional self-sufficiency. The family that formed around them, Betty's 2 boys and then their own son David, born in 1928, gave Montgomery a life outside the barracks and the classroom for the first time since adolescence. He was not a naturally effortless father in the way that easier men sometimes are, but he was devoted in his fashion, present in ways his own father had never managed to be, and fiercely protective. Betty softened some of the rougher edges of his personality, or at least gave them a context in which they did not dominate every room he entered. Those who encountered Montgomery during this period noted a man who was still formidable, still relentless in his professional habits, but no longer quite so isolated. The marriage seemed to give him a kind of permission to be a full human being, rather than simply a military project. In 1934, the family moved to Quetta, in what was then British India, where Montgomery took up a senior staff posting. Quetta was a garrison town, administratively important and professionally demanding, and he threw himself into the work with his customary intensity. He continued to develop and teach the methods of training and doctrine that he had refined at Camberley, pushing his officers toward the same standards of clarity and rigor that had come to define his professional identity. The intellectual environment at Quetta was in some ways more fertile than Camberley had been. The practical pressures of maintaining a frontier garrison gave his ideas a harder edge, grounding them in the logistical and tactical realities of actual deployment, rather than the slightly rarefied atmosphere of the Staff College. He produced training documents during this period that were models of concision, short, direct, free of the elaborate qualifications that made so much official military writing nearly unreadable under pressure. But it was not only the writing that mattered. What Montgomery was doing in Quetta, as he had been doing at Camberley before it, was building a culture. He was training not just individual officers, but shaping the way a generation of British Army officers thought about their work. The officers who passed through his courses carried his methods with them, his insistence on clear orders, his contempt for vagueness, his belief that every soldier in an operation should understand the purpose of what he was being asked to do, not merely the mechanics of how to do it. This was not universally welcomed. There were senior officers who found his manner overbearing and his ideas presumptuous. There were colleagues who rolled their eyes at his certainties, but there were also, increasingly, men of genuine quality who saw in his approach something the army urgently needed. By the middle of the 1930s, it was becoming impossible to ignore what was happening in Europe. Germany was rearming. The peace that had been purchased at such staggering cost was showing the first unmistakable signs of fragility. Montgomery, never a man inclined to comforting self-deception, read the situation with cold clarity. The army he had spent 2 decades trying to reform was still, in too many respects, the army that had stumbled into the Great War with inadequate doctrine and insufficient preparation. It had improved, but improvement was not the same as readiness, and readiness was what the coming years were going to require. He became louder, more insistent, more openly impatient with the pace of institutional change, a quality that did nothing for his popularity with those above him in the hierarchy, and everything for his standing with the officers who actually had to plan and execute operations. His personal life and his professional purpose had found, in these years, a rare and perhaps temporary equilibrium. Betty grounded him. His work gave him direction. His reputation, built slowly over 2 decades of relentless application, was solid enough to survive his abrasiveness and strong enough to draw serious professional attention. He was not yet a famous man. He was not yet a celebrated one. He was something more durable than either, an officer of genuine intellectual distinction who had spent 20 years learning from one catastrophic war and preparing, with everything he had, to prevent the next one from being equally catastrophic. What he could not know, and what no equilibrium could fully prepare him for, was the private disaster that was already gathering, quietly and without warning, in the form of his wife's declining health. That loss was still ahead, for now the years of building held. There are men whose lives seem to run on 2 separate tracks, the private and the professional, held apart by careful discipline, each feeding the other in quiet ways that even the man himself may not fully understand. For Bernard Montgomery, those tracks had never been entirely separate. Betty Carver had given him something no military career could manufacture: a softness, a place outside the wire, a reason to be something other than the officer. She was warm where he was rigid, open where he was armored, and the household they built together, first in England, then in Quetta, then wherever the army sent him, carried a quality of life that his childhood in a strict Anglican rectory had never quite provided. When she died, in the spring of 1937, from blood poisoning following an insect bite that had gone unnoticed and untreated, she had been ill for less than 2 weeks. There was no long farewell, no gradual adjustment. 1 week she was there, the next she was not. Montgomery was 50 years old, and the softer track of his life simply ceased to exist. He was not a man who expressed grief easily, or perhaps at all in any form that those around him would have recognized as grief. He did not weep publicly. He did not speak of her at length, or with the kind of open sorrow that invites sympathy. What he did instead was work, with an intensity that alarmed colleagues who thought they understood him, and confused those who were meeting this version of him for the first time. His son David, still a young boy, was sent to be cared for by family friends, a decision that would shadow their relationship for years and that Montgomery would later acknowledge carried real cost. The general was building a fortress, and he was building it out of method, out of schedule, out of doctrine, out of every tool of the professional soldier that he had spent 3 decades sharpening. The grief went underground. The work came up to fill the space it left behind. Those who served under him during this period described a man of extraordinary focus. He rose before dawn. He read and wrote until breakfast. His days were structured to the minute, not as affectation but as a survival mechanism, as though the empty hours that a less disciplined man might surrender to memory were hours he refused to leave unoccupied. Physical fitness became something close to a personal religion. He demanded it of himself, and he demanded it increasingly of those around him, not merely as a military virtue, but as evidence of mental seriousness. The unfit officer, in Montgomery's developing philosophy, was not just a physical liability. He was a man who had failed to take his own mind seriously enough to protect the instrument through which it operated. The logic was characteristically Montgomery, clean, total, and admitting of no exception. But it was not only discipline that the years after Betty's death produced, it was clarity, a kind of intellectual ruthlessness that he had always possessed in partial form, but that now found full expression. He had been skeptical of the British Army's intellectual habits for years, had argued in staff papers and training exercises that doctrine needed to be taught, tested, and reasoned through, rather than absorbed by osmosis from the example of one's seniors. Now he began to say these things aloud, in ways that could not be dismissed as junior impertinence. He had rank, he had a combat record, he had, at Quetta and at other postings, produced officers who could demonstrate the results of his methods in practical terms. What he lacked was patience for those who disagreed with him, and in the late 1930s, his patience was not growing longer. The British Army of that era was, in many respects, a deeply traditional institution, which is to say, it was an institution in which certain ideas about how officers ought to think and behave were transmitted less through formal instruction than through inherited assumption. A certain kind of social confidence was mistaken for military competence. An instinct for action was valued over an ability to plan. The gifted amateur, it was quietly believed, would always find a way through where the scientific plotter might hesitate. Montgomery found this view not merely wrong, but dangerous, and the evidence of the Great War, through which he had bled and from which he had returned with a wound that should have killed him, made the danger concrete rather than theoretical. Men had died in their hundreds of thousands because the people commanding them had trusted intuition over analysis. He was not willing to trust intuition. He was not willing to trust tradition. He wanted officers who could think. His approach to training during this period was, by the standards of the British establishment, almost theatrical in its deliberateness. He would present a problem, demand that officers reason through it aloud, and refuse to accept the answer, "It depends on the situation," as anything other than intellectual surrender. Every situation had characteristics that could be analyzed, resources that could be catalogued, options that could be evaluated. The officer who said, "It depends," was an officer who had not yet done the thinking. The officer who had done the thinking could explain his reasoning, defend it under pressure, and adapt it when circumstances changed, not by abandoning it, but by updating it with new information. This was not how most of his contemporaries had been taught, and it was not how most of them taught the officers below them. Montgomery did not consider this his problem. His reputation during these years was complicated. Among the junior officers who trained under him, the admiration was often intense. Here was a senior officer who took their development seriously, who could be withering in criticism, but who also gave reasons, who demanded not obedience but comprehension. Among his peers and superiors, the reactions were considerably more mixed. He was difficult, he was arrogant. He had a habit of expressing his opinions about the quality of other officers' thinking that those officers found less than collegial. He had always been abrasive. Now, stripped of the domestic ballast that Betty had provided, there was nothing to modulate him in his hours away from work. He was the work. The work was all there was. The strategic situation in Europe was sharpening by the late 1930s into something unmistakable. Germany had been rearming for years, openly, with a confidence that drew from the perceived weakness and indecision of the nations that might oppose it. In Britain, rearmament was underway but incomplete. The army was expanding, filling up with men who would need training, and the question of who would train them, and to what standard, and toward what conception of modern warfare, was not an abstract one. Montgomery had views on all of it. He believed the army needed to be educated in the real conditions of warfare that a major European conflict would produce, not the colonial small wars in which improvisation might suffice, but the industrial, mechanized, air-supported combat that the Spanish Civil War and the German army's own published doctrine were signaling with considerable clarity. He wrote, he lectured, he made himself, in some rooms, unwelcome. What is striking, in retrospect, is how accurately he read the situation and how much personal loss had contributed to the urgency of his reading. The man who had learned, at terrible personal cost, that the world could collapse without warning, had little interest in preparing for a war that was comfortable rather than the war that was coming. He had watched Betty die in days. He understood that time could run out before you noticed it had begun to shorten. The officer who trained for yesterday's conflict, who relied on yesterday's assumptions, would find tomorrow's battlefield waiting for him with something other than understanding. Montgomery had made his peace with loss. He had not made his peace with waste. By 1939, when the nature of the conflict ahead became unarguable, he was commanding the 3rd Infantry Division, a formation he was already in the process of reshaping according to principles he had been developing and arguing for across more than a decade. His division would be, by the standards of the British Army of that moment, exceptionally well prepared. It would be fit. It would train in conditions that approximated what it might actually face. Its officers would be expected to think, not merely to follow. This was not an accident, and it was not the result of Montgomery having been given unusually good raw material. It was the result of a man who had resolved, after the worst year of his life, that preparation was the only honest form of respect you could show the soldiers you were asking to risk everything. The war that he had been preparing for was coming. The army that had once found his methods eccentric was now, in quiet and sometimes reluctant ways, beginning to take them seriously. The man was unchanged in his essential character, still difficult, still certain, still exhausting in his absolute refusal to accept that good intentions were a substitute for good thinking. What had changed was the world around him, which had finally arrived, through catastrophe and drift, at a point where a man like Montgomery, hard-edged, systematic, unsparing, was less a disruption to the established order than a potential answer to what the established order had failed to prevent. France fell fast, not in weeks, in days. The German offensive that began in May of 1940 did not simply push the Allied armies back. It cut through them, severed their supply lines, split their command structures, and left entire formations standing in fields with no orders and no purpose, waiting for a collapse they still could not quite believe was happening. For the British Expeditionary Force, the campaign became something between a fighting retreat and a controlled disintegration, controlled, at least, in certain sectors, by certain commanders who refused to let discipline die when everything around them was dying. Bernard Montgomery was one of those commanders. He had spent 2 decades preparing for exactly this kind of crisis, and when it arrived, he met it with a coldness of mind that his fellow officers found either reassuring or deeply unnerving, depending on how well they knew him. Montgomery commanded the 3rd Infantry Division, a formation he had drilled, reorganized, and willed into a state of operational precision that stood apart from much of the British Expeditionary Force. He had taken command of the division with the same systematic ferocity he had applied to every command before it, stripping away complacency, demanding fitness, demanding that every officer understand not just their own orders but the logic behind them. When the German breakthrough at Sedan unraveled the Allied line and the retreat toward the Channel began, the 3rd Division moved with a coherence that was almost jarring against the backdrop of general collapse. Units withdrew in sequence, positions were handed off, flanks were covered. Panic, where it existed elsewhere, found no purchase inside Montgomery's formation. He moved through the chaos with the unshaken certainty of a man who had already decided that panic was a form of incompetence, and incompetence was something he simply did not permit. The roads of northern France and Belgium in those weeks were a study in collapse. Civilian columns mixed with military convoys, bombed vehicles blocked the routes, and the Luftwaffe owned the sky above. The Stuka dive bomber had become a weapon as much psychological as physical, its sirens engineered to strip men of their composure before the bombs arrived. Against this, Montgomery offered his men something almost unfashionable: clarity. He told them where they were going, why they were going there, and what they would do when they arrived. He issued clear, written orders. He moved forward to see conditions for himself, rather than managing the retreat from a comfortable distance. Within his sector, the machinery of command kept running when almost everything around it had ceased. Officers who served under him in those days described a man who seemed to exist in a separate, calmer reality, one defined entirely by the next task, the next objective, the next position to be held or handed over. The evacuation from Dunkirk between late May and early June of 1940 was, in one sense, a miracle of improvisation. The armada of small boats, the sheer scale of the rescue, the survival of more than 300,000 men who might otherwise have been lost to captivity or worse. In another sense, it was a disaster that had to be endured, rather than celebrated, and Montgomery had no patience for the softer version of events that began to circulate almost immediately. The British Army had been driven into the sea. Equipment had been abandoned across hundreds of miles of French countryside. The fighting capability of the nation had been reduced to the men who made it home and the weapons that still remained in Britain. Churchill's famous words transformed necessity into defiance, and the public found meaning in survival. Montgomery found it in the work that came next. He was promoted. The scale of the British defeat at Dunkirk created brutal vacancies in command, and Montgomery's performance during the retreat had been noted by those with the authority to act on such observations. He was elevated to command of the 5th Corps, one of the formations tasked with defending the southern coast of England against the German invasion that now seemed not merely possible, but imminent. The Wehrmacht had reached the Channel. The Luftwaffe was already testing British air defenses. For much of the summer of 1940, the question was not whether Germany would attempt to cross, but when and where, and whether the British Army, reduced and re-equipping, could do anything meaningful to stop them if they did. Montgomery threw himself into the defense problem with the kind of energy that frightened staff officers accustomed to more leisurely institutional rhythms. He inherited formations that were, in many cases, still recovering from the psychological shock of France. Men who had fought, retreated, and been rescued, and who now faced the prospect of standing their ground on British soil against the same enemy that had just dismantled them. The conventional approach to coastal defense, as Montgomery surveyed it, was static, reactive, and fundamentally wrong. Troops were strung in thin lines along beaches and cliff tops, spread too widely to concentrate against a landing, too far from their reserves to reinforce a threatened point before it collapsed. He saw a recipe for defeat before the battle had even started. His solution was characteristically aggressive and characteristically his own. Rather than defending the water's edge, he conceived of mobile reserves held back from the coast that could strike rapidly at any German force that came ashore, hitting it hard before it could consolidate a beachhead. The defense was not a line to hold, but a mechanism to counterattack. Units trained constantly. Not parade ground drills, but actual cross-country movement at speed, night navigation, rapid assembly from dispersed positions. He set physical fitness standards that his commanders initially questioned and his men initially resented. Those standards were not negotiable. Montgomery believed with absolute conviction that exhausted soldiers defending a static line would not defeat a German army that had just destroyed France. Only fit, mobile, and aggressive soldiers with a clear offensive purpose had any realistic chance. He also waged war on what he saw as the cultural rot of the British officer class. Staff officers who maintained comfortable offices at safe distances from their troops found themselves visited, questioned, and in some cases removed. He demanded that commanders be seen by their men, not inspecting from cars but walking among them, eating the same food, sharing the conditions. This was not sentimentality. It was a calculated understanding that soldiers fight better when they trust their leaders, and they cannot trust leaders they have never seen. The army Montgomery was building was not the army that had gone to France, not in spirit, not in method. It was being rebuilt from the inside, along lines that he had been arguing for 20 years, and that nobody had wanted to hear until the catastrophe of 1940 made the old arguments impossible to sustain. The summer of 1940 was the most dangerous period in British history since the Napoleonic Wars. The Battle of Britain raged overhead, and the outcome remained genuinely uncertain for months. Across the Channel, German planning for an invasion proceeded, was revised, was postponed, and ultimately, as the Luftwaffe failed to break the Royal Air Force, was shelved. The crisis passed not because Britain's army was ready to defeat a German landing, but because the Navy and the Air Force held the Channel. Montgomery knew this. He had no illusions about what the outcome of an actual German landing might have been in the summer of 1940, when his forces were still rebuilding from the wreckage of France. But by autumn, something had genuinely changed inside the formations under his command. They trained harder, moved faster, and understood their purpose more clearly than before. His public profile during this period grew in ways that would have surprised the Montgomery of 10 years earlier. He was not, by nature, a man who sought popularity for its own sake. His personal manner remained blunt, to the point of rudeness, his social performances uncomfortable at best. But soldiers responded to him in a way that did not depend on charm. He spoke plainly, he kept his promises, he held himself to the same standards he demanded of others. Stories circulated through the corps about inspections that ended badly for unprepared officers, about the general who walked into cookhouses to see whether the food was actually edible, rather than simply asking the quartermaster. These stories were not entirely flattering, but they communicated something the men valued, that Montgomery paid attention, that he took their welfare as seriously as he took any operational problem, and that he would not waste them. The years of defeat that had preceded him, the institutional torpor, the gentlemanly assumptions about how war should be conducted, had created an army that felt it could not win. Montgomery set himself against that feeling with the same systematic determination he applied to everything else. He did not simply tell men they would win. He showed them, day after day, through training and exercise and the brutal removal of incompetent officers, the mechanisms by which winning was actually possible. Confidence built not from speeches but from the accumulated evidence of a unit that functioned, that could move at night, that could concentrate faster than expected and hit harder than expected. This was the army he intended to take into battle, and the opportunity, when it eventually came, would not be in England. It would be in the deserts of North Africa, under conditions that bore no resemblance to the Channel coast, against an enemy whose reputation had grown to mythological proportions. What the experience of 1940 had given Montgomery, beyond the promotion, beyond the public recognition, was a laboratory. He had taken broken and frightened men and made them, through sheer force of method, into something approaching a professional fighting force. He had proved to himself, if not yet to the wider world, that the approach he had been developing since the trenches of the First World War was not merely theoretical. The discipline, the training, the clarity of orders, the refusal to accept the comfortable lie that morale was a natural condition rather than something earned through preparation, all of it worked. The army standing on the cliffs of southern England in the autumn of 1940 was not the army that had stumbled to the beaches of Dunkirk. And the general who commanded part of it was no longer simply an unconventional officer with unpopular ideas. He was, increasingly, the template for what British military leadership needed to become. By the summer of 1942, the British Eighth Army was not simply losing a campaign. It was losing faith in itself. Across the scorched limestone ridges and blinding salt flats of the Western Desert, a force that had been built to hold the line against Nazi Germany's most celebrated general had been pushed, battered, and outmaneuvered to the edge of collapse. Rommel's Afrika Corps had driven deep into Egyptian territory, bypassing fortified positions, encircling garrisons, and shattering formations that should have been able to hold. The fall of Tobruk in June had sent a shockwave through the entire Allied world, a garrison of more than 30,000 men surrendering in a single day, a fortress that had once been held for months, now gone in hours. Winston Churchill learned the news while sitting with President Roosevelt in Washington. He described it afterward as one of the heaviest blows of the entire war. The humiliation was total. The momentum was entirely in German hands. Cairo was preparing for the worst. The British embassy began burning documents in the courtyards of its buildings, thick black ash rising into the desert sky, an act so visible and so final that the locals named it Ash Wednesday. Families with means began quietly arranging travel south, toward Khartoum and beyond. The military stores along the Nile Delta were catalogued for rapid destruction if the Germans broke through. The Suez Canal, the artery of empire, the passage that connected Britain to India, to oil, to the entire eastern architecture of the war, sat roughly 60 miles to the east of where the front lines had settled. Those lines were at a place called El Alamein, a narrow coastal corridor flanked to the north by the Mediterranean Sea and to the south by the impassable depression of the Qattara, a vast expanse of salt marsh and sand that no armored force could cross. It was, in geographical terms, the last defensible position before Cairo, and the army holding it was exhausted, fractured, and afraid. The command arrangements were already in flux before Montgomery entered the picture. General Claude Auchinleck, the commander-in-chief Middle East, had personally taken control of the Eighth Army after a series of battlefield reverses, and he had succeeded in halting Rommel's advance during the First Battle of El Alamein in July. The line had held. Rommel had been stopped. But Churchill was not satisfied. He traveled personally to Cairo in early August, enduring a grueling flight through extreme heat, and what he found when he arrived deepened his anxiety. The atmosphere among senior officers was one of managed uncertainty rather than confidence. Plans for further retreat existed alongside plans for counterattack. The Eighth Army had developed what one visitor described as a kind of institutional nervousness, a reflex to consider withdrawal before it was necessary, bred by months of being outmaneuvered and outfought. Churchill decided that the command structure had to change completely, from the top down. His first choice to command the Eighth Army was General William Gott, a seasoned desert commander who was well-liked and broadly respected by the men who served under him. But fate intervened in the most brutal and arbitrary way that war allows. The aircraft carrying Gott was shot down by German fighters. He did not survive. The war is full of such moments, not destiny, simply accident, and this particular accident changed everything. With Gott gone, Churchill turned to the man who had been waiting in England with characteristic impatience for exactly this kind of opportunity. Bernard Montgomery was flown to Egypt almost immediately. He arrived in the middle of August 1942 into heat and dust and an army that badly needed to be told what was going to happen next. His first act was typically Montgomery. He moved into his new headquarters without ceremony and then immediately began dismantling the assumptions he found there. He discovered plans, carefully prepared contingency documents, for the withdrawal of the Eighth Army further east if Rommel attacked and broke through. He ordered them burned, not filed away, not revised, burned. It was a symbolic act as much as an operational one, and it was absolutely deliberate. Montgomery understood that an army which keeps its retreat plans close to hand is an army that is already half committed to retreat. He was not interested in managing defeat. He was interested in winning, and he intended the entire structure of command to believe that distinction in its bones. He then gathered his senior officers and spoke to them. The accounts of those who were present describe something shifting in the room as he talked, not because he said anything new in purely tactical terms, but because of the absolute, almost unsettling certainty with which he spoke. He told them that the days of what he called bellyaching were finished. The Eighth Army would fight where it stood. There would be no withdrawal, no further retreat, no planning for anything except attack and victory. He said these things without theatrical emphasis, without the cadences of a man trying to convince himself. He said them as though they were simply facts, observable realities, already determined. To men who had spent months in an atmosphere of improvisation and anxiety, it was profoundly strange. Some thought him arrogant, some thought him naive, some, the ones who would matter most, thought he might actually mean it. Montgomery's reorganization of the Eighth Army was not inspirational oratory followed by hope. It was systematic, methodical, almost clinical. He toured the formations, assessed the commanders, and made changes with a speed that surprised those accustomed to the slower rhythms of the British military establishment. Officers who had been placed in positions beyond their competence were moved. Fresh commanders who had demonstrated clarity under pressure were elevated. The structural arrangements that had led to ad hoc improvisation, dispersed tank formations fighting without coordinated infantry support, artillery deployed piecemeal rather than concentrated, were revised to reflect what Montgomery regarded as fundamental principles of modern warfare. These were not new ideas. They were, in his view, simply correct ideas that had not been applied. He was also acutely aware of the psychological dimension of command in a way that distinguished him from many of his contemporaries. He understood that an army's morale is not simply a matter of discipline or supply, but of trust. Trust in the man at the top. Trust that the man at the top knows what he is doing. Trust that the orders being given are the result of thought rather than panic. He set about making himself visible in a way that no previous Eighth Army commander had quite managed. He visited units, spoke to soldiers directly, wore a black beret with 2 badges, unconventional, instantly recognizable, and projected an aura of controlled confidence that was, frankly, calculated. He knew soldiers needed to see the face of command, and he gave them a face that looked entirely untroubled by the scale of what surrounded them. The news that Rommel would attack again reached Montgomery before it was received as a crisis. He had studied the intelligence, examined the terrain, and concluded with some confidence that Rommel's most likely axis of advance would swing south around the British left flank, and then drive north to cut off the coastal road. The resulting battle at Alam Halfa in late August and early September proved his analysis correct. Rather than launching an aggressive counterattack that risked the coherent force he was still rebuilding, Montgomery allowed Rommel to advance into a prepared killing ground. Concentrated anti-tank guns, armored formations positioned on ground of British choosing, and overwhelming artillery fire held the German advance and then stopped it entirely. Rommel, running short of fuel and absorbing punishing losses, withdrew. It was not the dramatic, sweeping victory that made for stirring headlines, but it was something rarer and more important. It was exactly what Montgomery said would happen, happening exactly as he said it would. That demonstration of controlled predictability changed the atmosphere within the Eighth Army more profoundly than any speech. Soldiers are not credulous. They have been promised victory by commanders before and then asked to explain the retreat. What Montgomery offered was different. He offered evidence. He said Rommel would come a certain way at a certain time and would be stopped at a certain place. Then Rommel came and was stopped, and the men who had done the stopping began to understand that they were being led by someone who actually knew what he was doing. The fear did not disappear entirely. Fear never disappears in the desert, where heat and exhaustion and the knowledge of what German armor can do are ever present. But the fear became manageable, directed, something that could be planned around rather than surrendered to. Churchill pressed for an early major offensive, frustrated by the pace of preparation and anxious for a headline victory before American forces landed in the West. Montgomery refused to be hurried. He told Churchill directly that he would not attack until his men were ready, and his material superiority was sufficient to guarantee not just a tactical victory, but a comprehensive destruction of the enemy. This was not bluster. This was the lesson he had been teaching himself since the Somme, that wars are not won by courage offered up carelessly, but by courage organized, sustained, and directed by preparation so thorough that the outcome stops being uncertain and starts being deliberate. He needed more tanks. He needed more shells. He needed his men trained to a standard that would survive contact with one of the most experienced armored forces in the world. He would wait until he had all of these things, and then he would move. The army he was building by October of 1942 was not yet perfect. No army ever is. But it was transformed. The men who had stumbled back across Libya now held their ground and drilled in it, rehearsing exactly the phases of attack they would be asked to execute. Commanders understood their objectives. Artillery had been concentrated and coordinated in a manner the Western Desert had not previously seen. Tank crews understood that they were not to fight alone, that infantry and engineers and close air support were part of a system in which each element depended on the others. This was not revolutionary thinking in the abstract. It was revolutionary thinking made concrete, drilled into tired bodies in killing heat, until it became automatic. Montgomery stood at the center of all of it, watching, correcting, utterly certain of what was coming. The desert waited. And across the wire, Rommel, himself exhausted, himself overstretched, himself running short of everything, waited too. By late summer of 1942, the Eighth Army had retreated across 2,000 kilometers of desert. Rommel's Africa Corps had pushed it to the brink of collapse, and Cairo itself seemed threatened. The British command structure was fractured. Morale among the troops had crumbled into something near despair, and London was bracing for the loss of Egypt. Into this crucible of failure and fear stepped Bernard Montgomery, a man virtually unknown to the soldiers under his command, but possessed of an absolute certainty about what needed to be done. He arrived in Cairo on the 13th of August 1942, and within hours he had begun dismantling the defensive mindset that had poisoned the Eighth Army's psychology. He issued orders that shocked many senior officers. Retreat was no longer an option. The next battle would be fought on ground of British choosing, with British advantages overwhelming, and the enemy would be defeated not through heroic desperation, but through scientific superiority in firepower, coordination, and planning. What Montgomery inherited was theoretically a substantial force, more than 200,000 men, hundreds of tanks, and comprehensive air support, yet it was an army organized for collapse rather than victory. The previous commanders had rotated through rapidly, each bringing different doctrines and approaches, leaving the soldiers confused and cynical. Officers mistrusted one another. Tank commanders operated without unified tactical doctrine. Artillery was dispersed in small, ineffective packets across the desert rather than concentrated. Supply lines were chaotic. The very soil seemed poisoned by defeat. Montgomery spent his first days touring the front lines, visiting divisional headquarters, and speaking directly to soldiers and junior officers. He listened more than he spoke at first, absorbing the texture of the army's despair. What he observed was not an army incapable of fighting, but an army that had been taught to expect defeat and therefore organized itself to minimize losses rather than achieve victory. This psychology of resignation had to be obliterated entirely before any tactical innovation could matter. His first operational decision was to halt the retreating movements and establish a defensive line at El Alamein, a narrow coastal plain between the Mediterranean Sea and the Qattara Depression, a vast salt marsh impassable to vehicles and armor. This geographic bottleneck meant that the enemy could not outflank them. The Eighth Army would hold this ground or die attempting, but it would not run again. Montgomery spent the final weeks of August and the whole of September preparing the position with meticulous care. He ordered the construction of minefields containing more than 500,000 mines, arranged in complex patterns designed to channelize German armor toward British anti-tank gun positions. He reorganized the tank arm into corps and divisions under unified command, establishing clear doctrines for tank infantry cooperation that had been absent before. He concentrated artillery into divisional and corps artillery groups, vastly multiplying their killing power through coordinated fire control. He implemented rigorous training programs for all units, drilling soldiers repeatedly in the specific battle procedures they would execute. Every officer and soldier was told precisely what their part would be in the coming operation. Mystery and improvisation were eliminated in favor of clarity and repetition. Rommel, observing these changes from the west, decided to strike before the British position became impregnable. On the 30th of August, 1942, he launched an offensive against the southern British positions, the culmination of his campaign to crush the Eighth Army and break through to the Nile Valley. The fighting that erupted across the desert that night revealed the magnitude of Montgomery's transformation. The German and Italian forces attacked with their customary aggression and tactical skill, but they encountered something they had not faced before: an army prepared methodically for their arrival, with minefields creating killing zones, with artillery fire coordinated by centralized command, with tank reserves positioned to strike at the moment of German commitment. The battle raged for 4 days through the first week of September. The Germans made tactical progress in places, but found the British reserves appearing exactly where they were needed, commanded by an intelligence that seemed to anticipate German movements. Montgomery's confidence, which had seemed almost absurd just weeks earlier, appeared validated by events unfolding on the ground. By the 4th of September, Rommel withdrew, acknowledging that the breakthrough was impossible and that his forces lacked the resources to sustain the offensive. The psychological shift was seismic. The Eighth Army had not merely held, but had repulsed the enemy. Soldiers who had resigned themselves to defeat now glimpsed the possibility of victory. Through September and into early October, Montgomery refined his preparations still further. He received reinforcements of fresh tanks, particularly the Sherman medium tank from America and the improved Crusader design from British production. Air superiority was reinforced through concentration of fighter squadrons under unified command. Supply lines from Alexandria and Port Said were reorganized to ensure that nothing would impede the army once it began its offensive operations. Montgomery issued orders that the assault would begin in the night of the 23rd of October, 1942, and that it would culminate in the total destruction of German and Italian forces. The objectives were communicated downward through every chain of command with extraordinary clarity. The timing was selected to coincide with a full moon so that the advance could be coordinated visually during darkness. Nothing was left to chance or improvisation. The level of detail in the planning orders was almost surgical in its precision. Every division knew not merely where it would attack, but the specific objectives for each brigade, each battalion, each company. The engineers knew where to clear lanes through the minefield. The artillery knew the exact coordinates of their targets and the timing of their bombardments. The medical services knew where casualty clearing stations would be established. The transport columns knew the routes of advance and the ammunition distribution schedules. For an army that had been taught to expect chaos and defeat, this clarity itself was a weapon almost as powerful as artillery. The battle commenced with a deafening explosion at 21:55 hours on the 23rd of October, 1942, when more than 800 artillery guns opened fire simultaneously across a narrow front of just 10 kilometers. The barrage was not random or sporadic, but a coordinated, sustained assault that continued through the night, destroying German and Italian positions, killing soldiers, incinerating vehicles, and psychologically overwhelming the defenders with the sheer weight of firepower. For the first time in the North African campaign, British artillery was being used not as a supporting arm, but as the dominant instrument of initial attack. Infantry units, British and Empire soldiers from South Africa, India, Australia, and New Zealand, advanced through lanes marked by phosphorescent tape, moving toward the German defensive positions. The minefield, which had seemed to promise an impenetrable barrier, became a killing ground where German engineers and soldiers fought desperately to hold passages against the advancing British infantry. Tanks of the Eighth Army followed, though their movement was constrained by the narrowness of the corridors and the density of the minefields. The fighting was brutally attritional. This was not cavalry charges or brilliant flanking movements, but rather grinding, systematic destruction of German capability through superior firepower, superior numbers, and superior coordination. The initial assault secured the first defensive line, but German reserves and Italian units counterattacked ferociously through the 24th and 25th of October. Montgomery's response demonstrated the essence of his operational method: reinforce success, continue the pressure, and refuse to allow the enemy respite. He directed fresh divisions into the attack, pushing through the initial penetrations and seeking to widen the breakthrough. The German defense stiffened as Rommel committed his reserve panzer divisions, and for a moment in the final days of October, the outcome seemed uncertain. But Montgomery possessed reserves that could be committed faster than Rommel could generate them. He possessed air superiority that German fighters could no longer contest. He possessed artillery superiority that meant every German counterattack was met by overwhelming British firepower. The attrition favored the side with greater resources, and that side was the Eighth Army. Day after day, the Germans were pushed back, fractionally, but continuously. The casualty rates on both sides were appalling. Soldiers who had believed themselves about to die instead watched the enemy begin to falter. By early November, the German defensive line began to crumble. Rommel, recognizing that he lacked the reserves to contain the British breakthrough and that his supply lines were increasingly threatened, began planning a withdrawal toward the west. Montgomery, sensing the breaking point, committed his mobile forces in pursuit, seeking to encircle and destroy the German armor before it could escape into the western desert. The final week of the battle saw the transformation from deliberate assault to pursuit, and pursuit to annihilation. German units fractured under the pressure. Italian formations, already suffering severe losses, began to disintegrate entirely. By the 4th of November 1942, the German and Italian forces were in general retreat, and Montgomery ordered his armor forward to pursue them relentlessly. The Germans retreated through Libya with the Eighth Army in pursuit, covering hundreds of kilometers in weeks rather than the months it had taken Rommel to advance. The strategic situation in North Africa, which had seemed settled in favor of the Axis powers just months before, was now reversed entirely. The Suez Canal was secure. Egypt was no longer threatened. The possibility of the Axis linking up with Japanese forces in Asia was eliminated. The significance of El Alamein extended far beyond the tactical destruction of an enemy army, or even the strategic security of Egypt. In London, Churchill received the news with a relief so profound it seemed almost physical. The British home front, which had absorbed years of setback and defeat from 1939 onward, suddenly possessed evidence that the enemy could be beaten through the application of superior will and planning. Soldiers of the Eighth Army who had believed themselves cursed or abandoned suddenly understood that they had been part of a victory worthy of celebration. The international community, particularly the Americans and the Soviet Union, recognized that Britain was not a power in terminal decline, but a military force capable of generating decisive victories. Eisenhower, who would soon meet Montgomery to plan the invasion of North Africa and Sicily, formed an understanding of the British general's methods and reliability that would shape their partnership for the remainder of the war. The press celebrated Montgomery as the savior of Egypt and the architect of the first major defeat inflicted on Nazi Germany. Photographs of him in his distinctive attire, the flat beret and the ornamental insignia, became iconic images of British resolve. Yet El Alamein also revealed truths about Montgomery that would haunt his reputation and shape the remaining years of the war. The victory had been achieved through methodical accumulation of superiority rather than through maneuver or deception or operational innovation. The enemy had been beaten by weight of numbers and firepower, by the ability to sustain casualties that the opposition could not match, by the possession of resources that simply overwhelmed the defender's capacity to resist. This was not elegant warfare. It was not warfare that inspired dramatic accounts or stirred the imagination as much as it reassured through its systematic elimination of chance. Montgomery's methods produced victories, but they produced victories of a particular character. Comprehensive, thorough, exhausting victories that consumed resources and time, but generated overwhelming certainty of outcome. Some observers, particularly among American officers who favored more rapid maneuver-based approaches to warfare, began to wonder whether Montgomery's extreme caution and emphasis on preparation might not prove to be a liability in more fluid theaters of operation. But to the soldiers under his command, to the war-weary home front, and to Churchill wrestling with strategic decisions that might reshape the war's outcome, Montgomery, after El Alamein, was something that Britain desperately needed, a military leader who won. The Battle of El Alamein had shattered a myth. For nearly 2 years, the German Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel had dominated North Africa with tactical brilliance and audacious maneuver, earning a reputation that spread far beyond the Mediterranean theater. Rommel, the Desert Fox, had become almost supernatural in the British imagination, a commander who could conjure victory from dust and disadvantage. Yet in the autumn of 1942, Bernard Montgomery had done something the British military establishment had begun to doubt was possible. He had defeated the Germans in a straight fight. The victory at El Alamein was not elegant. It was not a masterwork of deception or maneuver. It was instead a crushing demonstration of methodical superiority. More men, more guns, more supplies, applied with relentless discipline against an exhausted enemy. Montgomery's army had absorbed the fury of Rommel's counterattacks and ground them down through sheer attrition, coordinated by a general who understood that modern warfare rewarded patience and systematic preparation more than gambling dash. That realization would define everything that followed. In the weeks after El Alamein fell, Montgomery faced a choice that would separate him from every British commander who had preceded him in North Africa. He could have pursued Rommel with the urgency that victory typically demanded, hoping to destroy the Afrika Korps before it could regroup and flee westward toward Tunisia. That was the soldier's instinct, to follow up success with aggressive pursuit, to press the advantage before the enemy could reform. But Montgomery chose differently. He chose consolidation. He moved deliberately across Libya, pausing to secure supply lines, establish air bases, gather intelligence about German positions ahead, and ensure his own forces were fully prepared before advancing further. To some observers watching from London, the pace seemed almost glacial. Why was the army not moving faster? Why was Montgomery allowing Rommel time to establish new defensive positions? These questions reflected a fundamental misunderstanding about how Montgomery intended to wage war. He was not interested in pursuing an enemy that might still have the capacity to inflict casualties through surprise or through fighting from prepared positions. He intended instead to arrive at each engagement so thoroughly prepared, so vastly superior in resources, and so well rested that victory would be almost inevitable. This philosophy would eventually frustrate his American allies, but for the moment, on the ground in North Africa, it produced results that silenced the doubters. The pursuit from El Alamein to Tunisia unfolded across one of the harshest environments on Earth. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a world of rock and sand beneath a sun that seemed determined to incinerate anything with a pulse. Supply lines had to stretch hundreds of kilometers across this emptiness. Water was precious, fuel was precious. Every artillery shell, every can of biscuits, every bullet had to be transported across the desert, and any interruption in the supply chain could undermine an entire offensive. Montgomery understood this intimately. He had studied the failures of his predecessors in North Africa, commanders who had advanced too far, who had overextended their lines of communication, who had found themselves isolated and forced into retreat when German counterattacks threatened their supply routes. Montgomery would not repeat those mistakes. He moved his army forward in carefully coordinated stages. Once a position was secured, he halted, consolidated, brought up supplies, rebuilt his air bases, and ensured that his next step forward would be taken from a position of absolute security. To a warrior in a hurry, this must have seemed maddeningly slow. To Montgomery, it was the only rational approach to warfare. Yet something else was happening simultaneously to this deliberate military advance. Montgomery's image was being carefully constructed and broadcast back to Britain. He had understood, from his first days commanding the Eighth Army, that the home front needed heroes, and that a general could be a hero just as easily as a soldier in the ranks. Photographs of Montgomery began appearing in British newspapers, the angular face with its sharp nose and penetrating eyes, often wearing his distinctive black beret marked with the cap badges of multiple regiments, sometimes posed alongside enlisted men who gazed at him with undisguised adoration. The image was cultivated deliberately. Montgomery believed that soldiers fought better when they knew who their commander was, when they could attach a face and a personality to the chain of command. More cynically, he understood that a famous general was a general whose reputation with the press and the public could shield him against political interference. The more beloved he became, the more difficult it would be for critics in London to remove him or overrule his decisions. By the winter of 1942, Montgomery had become not simply a general who had won a battle. He had become a symbol of British resilience and of the possibility that the island nation, seemingly isolated and besieged, could still produce military leaders capable of defeating Nazi Germany. The newspapers seized upon the narrative with fierce enthusiasm. Headline writers had grown weary of stories about retreat and setback. For more than 2 years, the British public had endured losses in Norway, the Low Countries, France, and North Africa. The evacuation at Dunkirk, though presented as a victory of sorts, had been a defeat. The fall of Singapore had been humiliating. The sinking of warships had become routine. Then Montgomery arrived, and suddenly the headlines changed. A British general had stopped the German advance. A British general had defeated the legendary Rommel. A British general was advancing across the desert toward final victory. The public hungered for these stories, and the newspapers provided them in abundant supply. Photographs of Montgomery inspecting troops were published regularly. Accounts of his strategic brilliance were recounted in breathless prose. Comparisons to great commanders of history were made without embarrassment. Some of this came organically from the genuine relief and excitement that El Alamein had inspired, but much of it was also shaped by Montgomery's careful management of his own image. He was accessible to journalists when it suited him. He was quotable and memorable in interviews. He projected confidence that bordered on arrogance, which the public found reassuring in a general who was supposed to be leading them toward victory. Where other commanders had been cautious or self-effacing, Montgomery was boldly, almost defiantly, convinced of his own superiority. Winston Churchill, himself a man who understood the power of image and narrative, recognized what Montgomery was accomplishing. The Prime Minister had endured 2.5 years of military disappointment. His military commanders had been defeated or driven from Europe. The war in North Africa had dragged on indecisively, consuming resources without producing visible results. The public was weary, even as it remained determined. Then Montgomery appeared, and suddenly there was a general who seemed to radiate confidence that matched Churchill's own pugnacious determination to defeat Nazi Germany. The Prime Minister flew to North Africa in the autumn of 1942, meeting Montgomery and his senior officers. Their encounter appears to have been mutually satisfying. Churchill found in Montgomery a commander who spoke in clear, forceful terms about military strategy, and who showed none of the hesitancy or doubt that had characterized some of his predecessors. Montgomery found in Churchill a political leader who understood military affairs well enough to appreciate the necessity of careful preparation and methodical advance. Photographs from the visit show the two men together, Churchill's rounded frame and bulldog expression beside Montgomery's lean, angular frame and sharp features. The message was unmistakable. The Prime Minister had found his general, and his general was delivering victories. This political support became one of Montgomery's greatest assets. It meant that even when his decisions were questioned by other commanders or by military planners in London, Churchill's backing gave him the space to continue pursuing his strategic vision without constant interference. Throughout the winter and early spring of 1943, Montgomery's army continued its measured advance across Libya and into Tunisia. The German and Italian forces fell back before him, fighting occasional delaying actions but unable to mount a serious counterattack. Rommel himself, recognizing the strategic situation had become untenable, was ordered back to Europe, leaving his subordinates to command the rear guard. Montgomery captured one city after another. Tobruk fell, though it had changed hands so many times that its possession carried more symbolic than strategic weight. Then Tripoli fell, and with it came the satisfaction of having driven the Axis completely out of Libya and having advanced hundreds of kilometers across some of the world's most difficult terrain. The Eighth Army was revealed now not as a desperate force fighting for survival in North Africa, but as an army on the offensive, advancing toward Sicily and toward operations that would directly threaten Italian and German control of the Mediterranean. Soldiers who had endured 2 years of defeat and retreat began to believe that they were part of something genuinely significant, that their sacrifice was producing results that mattered. The costs had not been insignificant. The Eighth Army had suffered nearly 13,000 casualties at El Alamein and continued to absorb losses as the advance proceeded across North Africa. Tank crews trained and retrained because tanks were destroyed or disabled, and their crews were killed or wounded. Infantry battalions lost men constantly to enemy fire, to illness in the harsh climate, to accidents. The wastage of modern warfare was immense, even when the battles were not particularly costly in absolute terms. Yet Montgomery's careful approach meant that these casualties, though real and grievous to those who suffered them and their families, were far fewer than they might have been had he pursued a more aggressive or less methodical campaign. Soldiers who served under Montgomery developed a certain attitude about this. They knew they had a commander who would not waste their lives in futile gestures. They knew that the preparations would be thorough, the intelligence would be analyzed, the supplies would be available when the moment came to attack. They might be grumbled about the slowness of the advance or the meticulous preparations that seemed excessive to younger officers impatient for action, but they also knew that Montgomery's methods meant they had a better chance of surviving the war. That was a trade that most soldiers were willing to accept. The transformation in Montgomery's standing was remarkable when viewed against the broader canvas of the war in North Africa. When he arrived in August of 1942, the Eighth Army was a force in psychological disarray. Commanders had been rotated through with distressing frequency. The losses had accumulated. The question was not whether the Eighth Army would win in North Africa, but whether it could survive the next German offensive without being completely destroyed or driven out of Egypt. By the spring of 1943, Montgomery had transformed that army into a force advancing deliberately but inexorably toward Tunisia and Sicily. The soldiers had confidence in their commander. The public at home had a hero to celebrate. Churchill had a general who seemed to embody the qualities of determination and strategic clarity that the war demanded. The German and Italian forces, meanwhile, were falling back before an enemy that seemed to have gained not just materiel superiority, but also a kind of moral ascendancy. Rommel, despite his tactical brilliance and his legendary status, had been unable to stop Montgomery's methodical advance. The myth of German invincibility, already badly damaged at El Alamein, seemed to be crumbling further with every kilometer that the Eighth Army advanced. Yet beneath the surface of this triumphalism, tensions were building that would shape the coming campaigns in Europe. Montgomery's careful, methodical approach had worked brilliantly in North Africa against an enemy that was increasingly starved of supplies and reinforcements. The Desert Campaign had been fundamentally about attrition and resource management. Superior supplies, superior aircraft, superior intelligence had combined with Montgomery's careful coordination to produce victory. But American military commanders, particularly those who had fought in North Africa and would fight alongside the British in Sicily and later in Europe, held different assumptions about how warfare should be waged. American doctrine emphasized rapid movement, breakthrough, and exploitation, accepting higher risk in exchange for greater potential reward. Montgomery's insistence on methodical preparation and careful coordination struck many American commanders as unnecessarily cautious, as allowing the enemy time to escape that should have been destroyed. These differences had not yet become critical. The operations in North Africa were primarily British operations, with American forces playing a supporting role, but they foreshadowed disputes that would become far more serious once the campaign moved to Europe and American resources came to dominate the alliance. Montgomery's careful approach was celebrated now, but it would eventually become a source of genuine friction between him and commanders like George Patton, who could barely conceal their contempt for what they regarded as excessive caution. For the moment, however, Montgomery stood at the height of his reputation. He had won the first major British victory against the Germans. He had transformed a defeated army into a victorious one. He had captured the imagination of the British public and the confidence of the Prime Minister. The desert victory would remain throughout his career the accomplishment he regarded with the greatest pride, the campaign where circumstances had aligned most perfectly with his methods, where his meticulous preparation and his refusal to accept unnecessary risk had produced results that no other general seemed to have been able to achieve in North Africa. He was ready now for Sicily, and beyond Sicily for Europe and the great invasion that would determine the outcome of the entire war. But in these months in the spring of 1943, Montgomery was simply a successful general, celebrated and secure, commanding an army that believed in him and a nation that saw in him the embodiment of their determination to defeat Nazi Germany and survive the gravest crisis in their history. The victory at El Alamein had restored British honor, but it had also drawn Montgomery into a larger theater of war where he was no longer the unchallenged master of his domain. In the summer of 1943, as preparations began for the invasion of Sicily, Montgomery found himself operating within a command structure that was fundamentally different from the one he had dominated in the desert. The operation, codenamed Husky, would be an Anglo-American enterprise from its inception, and the balance of power was shifting unmistakably toward the Americans. Montgomery had never worked under American command before. His experience in North Africa had been solitary. He answered to a British chain of command, made decisions without consultation from across the Atlantic, and shaped the battlefield according to his own vision. Now he would be subordinate to an American Supreme Commander, Admiral Harold Alexander, who served under General Dwight Eisenhower's overall authority. The cultural and strategic differences between the British and American approaches to warfare had been masked by distance and separate theaters of operation, but Sicily would strip away that protective distance and expose the fissures that would shape the remainder of the war. Montgomery's vision for the invasion of Sicily was characteristically methodical. He believed that the Eighth Army should land on the southeastern tip of the island, establish a secure lodgment, and then drive northward up the eastern coast, using prepared positions and overwhelming firepower to batter German and Italian resistance into submission. The operation would be slow, deliberate, and grinding, precisely the opposite of what the Americans, particularly General George Patton, believed warfare should be. Patton represented an entirely different school of thought: rapid maneuver, exploitation of breakthroughs, the psychological dominance that came from speed and unpredictability. Where Montgomery saw the careful accumulation of advantages, Patton saw the possibility of decisive action through audacious movement. This was not merely a difference in tactical preference. It reflected fundamentally incompatible philosophies about how armies should function and what results could be achieved through military action. Montgomery's approach had been vindicated at El Alamein, where careful preparation and overwhelming superiority had crushed Rommel's attempt to break through to the Suez Canal. But Patton had never been tested in a major engagement, and he viewed Montgomery's caution not as wisdom but as timidity, a failure of nerve and imagination that prevented the decisive victory that aggressive action could achieve. The planning for Sicily became a battleground where these conflicting visions collided. The initial operational plan favored Montgomery's strategy. The Eighth Army would land south of Syracuse, establish itself firmly, and then advance methodically northward. The American Seventh Army under Patton would operate on the left flank, supporting Montgomery's main effort. To Montgomery, this arrangement made perfect sense. It concentrated force, it preserved the principle of clear command relationships, and it reflected his understanding that the island could be conquered only through sustained, coordinated action. But Patton and his supporters in American command saw the plan as a subordination of American forces to British direction, and they bristled at what they perceived as Montgomery's assumption that he should dictate the course of the campaign. The atmosphere in the planning meetings grew increasingly tense. Montgomery's absolute confidence in his own judgment, which had served him so well in the desert, now appeared to his American colleagues as arrogance and an unwillingness to acknowledge that American resources and American soldiers deserved a say in strategic decisions. The friction was real, it was personal, and it would not be resolved by the planning phase. It would only intensify once the shooting began. When the invasion commenced in the early hours of the 10th of July, 1943, the operation unfolded roughly according to Montgomery's expectations, but the initial phases revealed the fault lines that would widen as the campaign progressed. The Eighth Army's landings in the southeast proceeded with the efficiency that Montgomery's meticulous preparation had made possible. Troops moved ashore, established beachheads, and began the process of building up supplies and consolidating positions. But Patton's Seventh Army, operating on the western flank, encountered lighter opposition than expected and began to move forward with a speed and elan that suggested possibilities far beyond the scope of the original plan. Rather than remaining in a supporting role, Patton's forces began to surge westward and northward, moving faster than the scheduled timetable allowed, securing ground far in excess of what the initial operational plan had contemplated. Montgomery watched this development with mounting irritation. In his view, Patton was recklessly extending his lines of communication, operating without adequate supply, and most dangerously, failing to maintain cohesion with the main British effort. The operation was supposed to succeed through coordinated action and methodical advance, not through the improvisation and risk-taking that Patton seemed to embrace. The strategic disagreement became tactical reality by the middle of July. Patton had swung his army northward and was driving toward Palermo, the capital city on the northern coast of Sicily. His rapid advance was tactically impressive. His forces were moving through lightly defended territory, acquiring significant quantities of ground, and approaching an objective that would have strategic and psychological importance. But from Montgomery's perspective, Patton's movement represented a fundamental failure to understand the nature of coordinated warfare. Montgomery believed that Patton should have constricted his operations to the western flank, maintained supply lines that were manageable and secure, and driven northward only as fast as the main British effort could advance in the interior and along the eastern coast. Instead, Patton's dash toward Palermo pulled American resources away from the central axis of advance, left the Seventh Army operating independently rather than in coordination with the Eighth Army, and risked creating a situation where American forces would be isolated if German reinforcements arrived and counterattacked. The tension between the two commanders was now open and undisguised. Montgomery began to issue orders that attempted to constrain Patton's movements, asserting that as ground commander he had the authority to direct American operations. Patton responded with barely concealed fury, viewing Montgomery's directives as an attempt to thwart American success and deny American soldiers the opportunity to achieve a rapid, decisive victory. The fundamental issue underlying this tactical dispute was one that would plague the alliance throughout the war. Who had the authority to make decisions about how the campaign should unfold, and on what grounds should those decisions rest? In the Mediterranean, as in all subsequent operations, the nominal command authority fell to a British officer, first Admiral Alexander, then later Montgomery himself. But the American contribution to the campaign, both in material resources and in casualties, gave American commanders the political and military weight to resist British strategic direction. Moreover, there was a genuine disagreement about what constituted sound military practice. Montgomery's approach had been validated by success at El Alamein, but that success had come in a theater where the Eighth Army faced a relatively small opponent with limited resources and where overwhelming superiority in men and materiel made careful coordination a feasible strategy. Sicily was different. Italian forces were poorly trained and motivated, German forces were few in number, and the island itself was relatively small. The conditions that made Montgomery's methodical approach necessary in North Africa did not exist in Sicily. Patton's intuition that rapid maneuver and aggressive exploitation could achieve results more quickly than methodical advance had merit, given the actual circumstances of the campaign. Yet Montgomery could not concede the point, either strategically or personally. To do so would mean acknowledging that his way was not the only way, that American commanders might have insights that contradicted his own judgment, and that his authority as ground commander could be questioned. His response was to become increasingly insistent on his right to direct the campaign, and increasingly dismissive of American tactical thinking. He issued orders that attempted to limit Patton's westward movement, arguing that American forces were scattering their effort and leaving themselves vulnerable. He complained to his superiors that Patton was acting recklessly, and that unless American operations were brought under Montgomery's direct control, the campaign would become chaotic. But Patton had supporters in the American chain of command who saw in his aggressive approach the very qualities that American military culture celebrated. They defended his actions, pushed back against Montgomery's attempts at control, and began to question whether the British general's methods, however successful in North Africa, were appropriate for operations in Sicily. The dispute was not resolved by clear command authority. Instead, it festered and intensified, poisoning the personal relationships between the commanders and creating a precedent for future conflicts. The invasion of Sicily ultimately succeeded, but it succeeded despite the friction between Montgomery and Patton, rather than because the two commanders worked in genuine harmony. Patton's rapid drive to Palermo achieved its objective and provided American forces with a morale boost and a sense of independent achievement that contrasted with the slower, more methodical British advance along the eastern coast. Montgomery's forces, moving methodically inland and along the coast toward Messina, made steady progress, but faced stiffer resistance as German forces concentrated their defenses. The campaign lasted some 38 days, ending with the final capture of Messina and the complete conquest of the island. But the victory, while undeniable, had been achieved by two armies operating on divergent strategic lines, rather than as a unified force pursuing a coherent plan. The invasion had demonstrated that American commanders would not accept British strategic domination without question, and that American soldiers were capable of rapid, aggressive operations that produced results. It had also demonstrated that Montgomery could not extend his authority over American operations without generating resentment and resistance that would ultimately limit his control. The consequences of this clash extended far beyond Sicily. The operation had exposed a fundamental tension in the alliance that would intensify as the war continued and American resources came to overwhelmingly dominate the combined effort. In the Mediterranean, and later in Northwest Europe, the question of who made strategic decisions and on what basis would become increasingly fraught. Montgomery had built his reputation on the principle that careful planning and meticulous preparation could overcome almost any obstacle. But Sicily suggested that rapid maneuver and aggressive exploitation might sometimes be more appropriate, and that the American way of war, less concerned with orderly advance and more focused on exploitation of opportunity, might achieve results that Montgomery's methods could not match. The fact that Patton's rapid advance to Palermo had not resulted in disaster or encirclement suggested that some of Montgomery's caution might have been excessive, and that American commanders were right to push back against constraints that seemed designed more to assert Montgomery's authority than to achieve military objectives. The personal animosity between the two commanders poisoned their working relationship for the remainder of the war. They would encounter each other again in Northwest Europe, where the same tensions would resurface and where the balance of American resources would become even more overwhelming. Montgomery would never fully accept that American commanders had legitimate strategic insights, and Patton would never acknowledge that Montgomery's careful approach had produced results that reckless speed could not achieve. The debate between them was not trivial. It reflected genuine disagreements about military method that would shape the conduct of campaigns and influence the outcome of battles. But the debate took place in an atmosphere of personal mistrust and competitive rivalry that prevented the kind of candid discussion that might have produced genuine synthesis. Instead, each commander maneuvered to advance his own approach and discredit the other, and the alliance succeeded despite the tensions rather than because they were resolved. Sicily demonstrated that Montgomery's authority was not absolute, and that American commanders would no longer simply accept British strategic direction without question or resistance. It showed that the methods that had triumphed in the desert might not be universally applicable, and that different circumstances might call for different approaches. It suggested that the American way of rapid maneuver and aggressive exploitation, which Montgomery regarded with suspicion, had its own validity and could produce results that careful, methodical advance might not achieve. But these lessons were not drawn openly or clearly. Instead, they festered beneath the surface of the alliance, creating patterns of suspicion and rivalry that would intensify as the war moved closer to German territory and the stakes became even higher. The invasion of Sicily in 1943 was a military success, but it was also the beginning of a conflict within the alliance that would complicate the final campaign in Europe and strain the partnership between Britain and America in ways that would not be fully resolved until victory had been achieved and the partnership itself had become strained to the breaking point. The Italian campaign that followed Sicily would deepen these tensions still further. Montgomery's transfer to Italy to command the Eighth Army's assault across the Strait of Messina left him still in a Mediterranean theater, but increasingly he would watch as strategic priorities shifted toward Northwest Europe and toward the preparations for the invasion of Normandy. The lessons of Sicily about the limits of his authority and the strength of American resistance to his strategic vision would prove to be merely the opening movement in a larger conflict that would define the final campaigns of the war in Europe. Montgomery had learned that he could not simply command American forces into compliance with his strategic vision. He would have to persuade, negotiate, and sometimes simply endure decisions that he believed were militarily unsound. It was a hard lesson for a commander of his temperament, and one he never truly accepted. But acceptance or not, it was a lesson he would have to learn, because the future of the alliance and the course of the war in Europe would be shaped by commanders who refused to subordinate their own vision to Montgomery's authority, no matter how much that vision had been vindicated by success. By the autumn of 1943, the strategic momentum of the Second World War had begun to shift irreversibly toward the Allies. The Soviet Union, bleeding but unbroken, pushed westward against the Wehrmacht across the steppes of Russia. In North Africa and Sicily, American and British forces had established themselves as capable instruments of modern warfare, and yet, for all these gains, Nazi Germany still occupied the whole of Western Europe, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, a fortress that had resisted invasion for nearly 4 years. The only path to final victory lay across the English Channel. A massive, coordinated amphibious assault would need to punch through Nazi defenses, establish a foothold on French soil, and begin the long, violent work of liberating an entire continent. But how that invasion would be planned, shaped, and executed remained uncertain. In August of 1943, when the combined chiefs of staff appointed Bernard Montgomery as ground commander of all forces for Operation Overlord, that uncertainty began to crystallize into strategic vision. Montgomery arrived at the planning headquarters in London, carrying the weight of recent vindication. Alamein had proven him right about the necessity of overwhelming force and meticulous preparation. His careful pursuit across North Africa had demonstrated that victory came not from reckless maneuver, but from patient accumulation of advantage. Sicily had brought him into direct collision with American commanders who favored rapid exploitation over methodical consolidation, and from that friction had emerged a hard truth. The coming invasion of France would require not merely British brilliance, but seamless coordination with American resources on a scale never before attempted. Montgomery understood this reality with perfect clarity. He was not a man given to sentimentality about inter-allied harmony, but he possessed an almost geometric appreciation of the problem. If the invasion failed, if the beachhead could not hold, if the Germans pushed the Allies back into the sea, then all the sacrifices of 3 years of war would count for nothing. He threw himself into the planning with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The first months of 1944 became a furious intellectual campaign. Montgomery began attending the planning meetings at Norfolk House, where American, British, and Canadian planners had already sketched out an initial design for the invasion. What he found alarmed him. The existing plan, shaped largely by the Supreme Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, and his predecessor, General Sir Frederick Morgan, called for a landing on a relatively narrow front with limited forces. The assault would use roughly 4 divisions, supported by 3,000 aircraft and 1,000 ships. Montgomery studied these figures with cold calculation and rejected them almost entirely. The frontage was too narrow, the forces were too thin, the preliminary bombardment was insufficient. The plan seemed to him a blueprint for catastrophic failure, dressed up in optimistic language. He said so, bluntly, in meetings with Eisenhower, with the chiefs of staff, with American General Omar Bradley, who commanded the First Army. He was tactless and abrasive about it, but he was also right. Over the following weeks, Montgomery's vision for Overlord emerged with increasing clarity. The invasion must use nearly double the initial assault forces, 5 divisions instead of 3, with additional airborne units inserted before dawn to disrupt German reserves and communication. The landing zones must stretch across a wider front, roughly 50 miles of Normandy coast, divided into British and Canadian sectors in the east and American sectors in the west. Air supremacy must be absolute and established weeks before the landing, through sustained bombing of German airfields and aircraft production. The ports themselves must be destroyed in advance through aerial bombardment so that the Germans could not use them for counterattack. The preliminary bombardment in the days immediately before the invasion must be overwhelming, conducted by hundreds of bombers and naval guns to break enemy morale and destroy fortifications. Most crucially, the operation must proceed in phases. The initial assault to establish the beachhead, then a period of consolidation and buildup of supplies, then a deliberate, coordinated breakout toward the interior. This was not the strategy of improvisation or breakthrough. It was the strategy of a commander who believed that modern warfare had become too complex, too lethal, too dependent on logistics and coordination to leave anything to chance. Eisenhower resisted at first. The American preference had always been for rapid, audacious maneuver, the strategy that had worked in North Africa and Sicily when circumstances favored it. Double the assault forces meant finding additional ships and landing craft that were in desperately short supply across all theaters of war. Delay for preparation meant postponing the invasion from spring into summer, which meant risking the weather and the narrowing of the operational window before autumn storms made the channel impassable. The cost, in resources and time, seemed staggering. But gradually, Eisenhower came to accept Montgomery's logic. Consultation with the naval commander, Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, revealed that enough landing craft could be scraped together from across the theater if priority was given to Overlord. The British chiefs of staff supported Montgomery's vision, and most importantly, the logic proved irrefutable. A beachhead that failed would waste infinitely more resources than a beachhead that succeeded. On that simple foundation of military common sense, Eisenhower aligned himself with Montgomery's strategy. The intellectual victory came with a price. Montgomery's personality, never modest, became increasingly assertive as the planning intensified. He spoke with absolute certainty about the inevitable success of the invasion because he had planned for every contingency. He told American generals that their ideas were unworkable. He corrected subordinates in front of peers. He made clear his contempt for planning that relied on improvisation. In meetings with Eisenhower and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, he could be graceless about accepting counsel from those he deemed intellectually inferior to his systematic mind. Churchill particularly resented Montgomery's evident certainty that the Prime Minister's strategic instincts were amateurish compared to the rigor of military planning. These personality conflicts were managed, but never resolved. They would create friction for the remainder of the war, but in the spring of 1944, they mattered far less than the substance of the plan itself. Montgomery's vision had become the operational reality. The invasion would be launched as he conceived it, at the scale he demanded, with the phasing and coordination he insisted upon. By the winter of 1944, as planning moved into its final and most intense phase, Montgomery established his command headquarters and began the task of coordinating 4 separate armies: the British Second Army under General Sir Miles Dempsey, the Canadian First Army under General Harry Crerar, the American First Army under General Omar Bradley, and the American Third Army under General George S. Patton, who would land later. He created a vast apparatus of staff planning, exercises, and rehearsals. Divisions practiced amphibious assault on the coast of Wales and southern England. Naval gunfire coordinators trained alongside infantry officers. Commanders at every level memorized the terrain they would fight on through aerial photographs and sand table models. Montgomery personally visited formations, speaking to enlisted men and officers about the plan, about his confidence, about the inevitable outcome. He radiated certainty in an operation that seemed almost impossibly complex. That certainty was not arrogance alone, though arrogance was present. It was the product of meticulous planning combined with genuine confidence that when a military operation was designed with sufficient care and executed with sufficient discipline, success became not merely possible, but probable. The question of air power had consumed months of argument between Montgomery and other commanders. The British Air Marshal, Sir Arthur Tedder, Deputy Supreme Commander, had expressed serious reservations about the bombing campaign that Montgomery demanded. Tedder believed that sustained bombing of French civilian infrastructure would alienate the French population and create political complications. He feared that the preliminary bombardment would prove insufficient and merely alert German defenses without destroying them. Montgomery countered with the argument that air superiority was not a luxury but an absolute necessity. If the German Luftwaffe could challenge Allied air supremacy over the beachhead, the invasion could fail despite all other precautions. Therefore, the bombing campaign must be prosecuted without compromise. It must target not only military installations but transportation networks, supply lines, and the infrastructure that connected German reserves to the front. In the end, the combined chiefs of staff sided with Montgomery. The bombing campaign proceeded at an intensity that ravaged French infrastructure and killed thousands of French civilians, a moral cost that Montgomery acknowledged but did not permit to alter his strategic judgment. The deception plan that surrounded Overlord owed much to Montgomery's emphasis on methodical preparation. For months, an elaborate charade had been constructed to convince the German High Command that the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, far to the north of the actual landing zones in Normandy. Dummy armies were created and announced through captured German agents. Radio traffic was fabricated to suggest massive buildup in southeast England. Double agents fed carefully constructed lies to German intelligence officers. Montgomery understood the utility of this deception not as a substitute for overwhelming force, but as a complement to it. If the Germans could be made to believe that the initial Normandy landings were merely a feint, they would hold their reserves in the north, awaiting the true invasion at Pas de Calais. That delay of 48 hours, or even 24 hours, could mean the difference between a beachhead that held and one that broke. Deception married to overwhelming force and meticulous planning, this was the formula that Montgomery had constructed. As spring turned toward summer in 1944, the invasion fleet assembled in British ports in a marshalling operation of staggering complexity. More than 5,000 ships and landing craft, carrying nearly 3 million men, were organized into convoys and assigned to specific embarkation ports. Supplies, ammunition, fuel, rations, medical equipment, replacement vehicles were calculated down to the last ton and stowed into cargo vessels with mathematical precision. The weather became an obsession. The invasion required a combination of tidal conditions, moonlight for the airborne assault, and sufficient daylight for the naval bombardment and initial landings. These conditions aligned only on a few possible dates. Meteorological forecasts became matters of war and peace. As the date of the invasion was set, postponed, set again. Montgomery remained unmoved by the anxiety that infected the command structure. He had done what could be done through planning and preparation. The rest lay with execution and fortune. To a subordinate who expressed anxiety about the weather, Montgomery replied with characteristic bluntness that the plans were sound and would be executed as designed. Worry was a luxury that belonged to those who had not prepared sufficiently. On the 4th of June 1944, as the invasion fleet began to sail from English ports toward Normandy, Montgomery issued a final message to the forces under his command. The statement was a masterpiece of calculated leadership. He told the soldiers and sailors that the operation was the beginning of the invasion of Western Europe, that it would liberate oppressed peoples, that it would result in the defeat of Hitler and all the Nazi regime represented. He spoke not of the difficulties ahead, but of the righteousness of the cause and the inevitability of success. He told them that they had been trained thoroughly, equipped lavishly, and were led by experienced officers who understood the task before them. He promised that if they did their duty, as he was confident they would, then victory would be theirs. The message was neither complex nor original, but it was delivered by a commander who had built every aspect of the operation on the premise that careful preparation, combined with clear purpose, could overcome even the most daunting obstacles. The soldiers who read those words, or heard them recited by their officers, understood that they were going into battle under a general who believed absolutely that they would win. The evening of the 5th of June arrived with gray skies and choppy seas. The airborne forces, thousands of American and British paratroopers, began boarding their aircraft for the flight across the Channel. Montgomery visited one of the American units, speaking to soldiers who would land in the darkness behind enemy lines, and they responded to his presence and his words with the respect that soldiers offer to commanders who have earned their confidence through competence. As darkness fell, the air filled with the sound of aircraft engines. The greatest amphibious assault in human history was about to begin, and it would proceed according to the plan that Montgomery had demanded and fought for through months of argument and resistance. He had prevailed not merely through force of personality, but through the logic of his vision, that modern warfare, conducted at this scale against an enemy as dangerous as Nazi Germany, required not inspiration and improvisation, but systematic thinking, overwhelming force, detailed preparation, and a clear-eyed assessment of what could go wrong and how to prevent it. Whether that vision would survive the chaos of actual combat, and whether the soldiers and ships and aircraft could execute what the planning staffs had so meticulously designed, remained to be seen when dawn broke on the 6th of June 1944. The beaches of Normandy on the 7th of June were not the triumphant visions that photographers would later memorialize. They were choked with wreckage, congested with men pressed against obstacles and each other, and commanded by German artillery that still found targets among the landing craft and supply vessels. The first phase of Operation Overlord had succeeded. The Allies had punched through the Atlantic Wall, but success was merely the threshold. Beyond the beaches lay the bocage, the dense Norman world of thick hedgerows and sunken roads that would transform the beachhead from a place of rapid maneuver into a grinding contest of attrition. Montgomery stood in this landscape with a clarity of vision that would define the entire campaign. The beachhead must be consolidated before any breakout could be attempted. He would build supply lines before launching attacks. He would gather strength before striking decisively. This approach, cautious, methodical, and completely at odds with the American appetite for rapid exploitation, would create the first serious strategic rift among the Allied commanders, and would make Montgomery the object of mounting frustration in the days and weeks that followed. The immediate challenge was one of space and logistics. The Allied forces ashore occupied a ribbon of beach between 10 and 20 kilometers wide and only a few kilometers deep. Behind them lay a sea filled with transport ships that could deliver only the men and supplies that came off the beaches, and the beaches themselves were saturated with the debris of invasion. Tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces were piled at the waterline. Wounded men were loaded onto outbound craft while fresh troops pushed inland. Control over the beaches meant control over the entire operation, and Montgomery enforced discipline with an almost ruthless clarity. Supplies could not be released from the beaches unless they had a designated destination and a unit prepared to receive them. Units could not advance without clear orders and fire support. Officers who violated these principles faced his immediate censure. His staff coordinated the flow of men and material with the same precision that a surgeon employs in operating theater. Every scalpel in its place, every movement economical and purposeful. This was not the warfare of inspiration or daring. It was the warfare of systems, and Montgomery had built systems that worked. The first days ashore revealed that the beachhead could not expand as rapidly as had been hoped. The German defenses, though shattered by the landing, were not shattered completely. Counterattacks came from inland, and while none succeeded in driving the Allies back into the sea, they prevented the rapid encirclement of enemy forces that Montgomery had sketched in his operational planning. The British Second Army under Montgomery's nominal subordinate General Miles Dempsey faced particularly fierce resistance around the city of Caen, an objective that should have fallen on D-Day itself, but which remained in German hands even after the first week. The commitment of German panzer divisions to counterattack after counterattack imposed a terrible cost. Tanks knocked out, men killed and wounded. But it also meant that the German command was committing its reserves piecemeal rather than in a coordinated mass. Montgomery saw this pattern and understood its implications. The Germans were absorbing their reserves into a grinding battle of attrition exactly where he wanted them. The Americans, meanwhile, pressed westward toward Cherbourg and southward toward Saint-Lô. The Cotentin Peninsula, if it could be captured intact with its port facilities, would open a second major supply line. This seizure became the American priority, while the British and Canadians remained locked in their costly struggle around Caen. By the second week of June, the pattern of the campaign began to crystallize, and with it came the first serious complaints from American commanders. General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army in the American sector, grew increasingly impatient with what he perceived as Montgomery's caution and his unwillingness to commit forces to a decisive breakthrough. The American forces had captured Cherbourg, though at great cost, and with much of the port facility demolished by the retreating Germans. The drive southward toward Saint-Lô was grinding slowly against German resistance. Bradley's instinct was to exploit momentum, to attack in multiple directions, to keep the Germans off balance through rapid maneuver. Montgomery's instinct was the opposite. He wanted to hold the Germans in place with the British and Canadian forces, while the Americans built up strength and seized the advantageous terrain from which a coordinated breakout could begin. The two strategies were not necessarily incompatible, but they created a perpetual friction between cautious British planning and aggressive American action. Montgomery's reports to London and to Eisenhower at Supreme Allied Headquarters emphasized the necessity of patience, the wisdom of consolidation, and the certainty that the Germans would eventually exhaust themselves in futile counterattacks. His tone carried absolute confidence, but to American ears it sounded like excuse-making, like a general who had lost his nerve after the initial success. The truth was more complex. Montgomery had not lost his nerve. Rather, his nerve was of a different character than what the Americans possessed or understood. He had watched for 4 years as British operations were launched with confidence and ended in retreat or stalemate. He had seen the Mediterranean campaign dragged out through Sicily and up the Italian peninsula, consuming resources and time without producing decisive results. He had absorbed the lessons of the First World War and of desert warfare, that modern armies could absorb terrible punishment, and that only when the enemy had been softened through attrition and his reserves exhausted could a decisive breakthrough be achieved. The Germans had nearly 200,000 men in Normandy by the third week of June, most of them concentrated in the British and Canadian sector. Every day that these forces remained pinned down fighting for towns and villages was a day that they could not be redeployed to challenge the American breakout. Montgomery understood that he was fighting a battle within the larger campaign, and that the larger campaign would be won not by his forces but by the Americans, once they had the space and time to concentrate their strength. His role was to buy that time and create that space through the application of steady pressure and the acceptance of casualties. The containment strategy became explicit in the orders issued from Montgomery's headquarters during the third week of June. The British and Canadian forces were to press forward around Caen, to engage German panzer reserves, and to prevent any German concentration for a coordinated counteroffensive against the American sector. The offensive would proceed as an attritional battle, with set-piece attacks backed by overwhelming air and artillery support, designed not for rapid territorial gain, but for the wearing down of German strength. The Americans, meanwhile, were to consolidate the Cotentin Peninsula and prepare for a breakout attack southward that would eventually swing eastward to threaten the German rear. This strategy required American patience, the patience to build strength in the bridgehead, while the British bore the brunt of German panzer attacks. It required faith in Montgomery's judgment that the grinding battle in the Bocage served a larger strategic purpose. Some American commanders possessed this faith. Bradley himself, whatever his frustrations with Montgomery's caution, understood the logic of the strategy and accepted it. Others, particularly those officers who had never served under British command and who viewed Montgomery with either suspicion or disdain, questioned whether he was genuinely committed to a vigorous prosecution of the campaign or whether he was simply incapable of the aggressive action that the situation demanded. The battle in the Bocage became the proving ground for this strategy, and it was not a battle that produced dramatic results or newspaper headlines about triumphant breakthroughs. Instead, it produced names that would be remembered primarily by those who fought there. Villers-Bocage, a small town that the British attempted to outflank and where German armor inflicted significant losses. Rauray, Hill 60, and the countless hedgerows and sunken roads where men fought and died for a few hundred meters of ground. The German commander in Normandy, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, threw panzer counterattacks at the British and Canadian lines with increasing desperation, attempting to regain the initiative before the Allies could concentrate overwhelming force. The panzer divisions suffered terribly in these attacks, knocked out by anti-tank guns and aircraft, replaced by hastily scraped-together reserves. The German soldier fought with skill and determination, but the attrition worked remorselessly in the Allies' favor. For every tank the British lost, the Germans could not replace it. For every panzer division committed to the grinding battle around Caen, that division was unavailable for use elsewhere. The strategy, from the vantage point of June, was working exactly as Montgomery had designed it. Yet the tension between British caution and American ambition continued to mount. Eisenhower himself, concerned that the beachhead was not expanding rapidly enough and that the consolidation phase was stretching too long, visited Montgomery's headquarters and raised questions about the overall strategy. Montgomery responded with his characteristic combination of absolute confidence and contempt for those who questioned his judgment. The plan would work, he assured Eisenhower. The Americans would break out, envelop the German forces, and the campaign would end in complete victory. All that was required was patience and the discipline to follow the plan. Eisenhower, a supreme commander tasked with keeping the Anglo-American alliance from fracturing and maintaining unified direction of the campaign, accepted this reassurance, though he made clear that he expected the breakout to accelerate. The American press, denied the rapid victories that the public had anticipated, turned increasingly critical of Montgomery and of the British conduct of the campaign. Headlines questioned his judgment, his caution, his willingness to sacrifice American lives for British strategy. In response, Montgomery began to orchestrate his own press campaign, hosting journalists and explaining the necessity of patient warfare, the dangers of premature breakout, and the certainty of eventual victory. His tone was often condescending. He seemed to be explaining a simple truth to those too uninformed to understand it. This further irritated American commanders and contributed to the growing sense that Montgomery believed himself superior to his allies. By the first week of July, the beachhead had stabilized into a front that extended roughly from Cherbourg on the American right to the west bank of the Orne River on the British left. The perimeter was secure against immediate German counteroffensive, and the flow of supplies through the beaches and over the hastily constructed artificial harbors had reached a rate that could sustain offensive operations. Caen, which had been supposed to fall on D-Day, was finally captured at the end of the first week of July, after the medieval city had been reduced to rubble and thousands of civilians killed in the bombing that preceded the assault. The cost had been substantial, and the Germans had managed to withdraw the majority of their armor before the encirclement could close. Yet the pattern of the campaign remained clear. The Germans were being worn down by the British and Canadian pressure, while the Americans gathered strength for the decisive blow. Montgomery issued new orders directing the Americans to begin their breakout toward St. Lo and beyond, while the British and Canadians would continue to press eastward, driving toward the city of Falaise, in a movement that would eventually threaten the German right flank. The strategy, despite the friction it created with American commanders and the criticism from the American press, was beginning to produce the results that Montgomery had predicted. The lodgment phase of the Normandy campaign would eventually be judged a success, though success came at a cost in blood and time that seemed wasteful to those who had expected rapid victory. The beachhead was secured. The supply lines, though fragile and vulnerable to bad weather, were operating at a rate that allowed offensive operations. German reserves, committed piecemeal to a grinding battle of attrition in the bocage, were being consumed without achieving any breakthrough. The Allies controlled the air absolutely, and German attempts to coordinate large-scale operations were disrupted by air interdiction that made movement in daylight nearly impossible. The German command, trying to hold its line against superior resources and losing ground with every passing week, faced a strategic dilemma that had no good solution. They could concentrate forces for a massive counteroffensive, but they lacked the reserves and the mobility to execute such an operation successfully. They could retreat to more defensible positions, but this would mean abandoning the territory that they had held before the invasion and surrendering the initiative entirely to the Allies. They could attempt to hold the line and gradually wear down the Allies through attrition, but the Allies had far greater reserves of men and material and could sustain this battle indefinitely. The only viable strategy was the one they were already attempting, a fighting withdrawal while attempting to limit Allied freedom of maneuver, and this strategy was failing because Montgomery had anticipated it and designed his operations around it. By the end of July, the beachhead encompassed an area of roughly 1,500 square kilometers, and the Allies had assembled more than 1 million men ashore. The American breakout from the beachhead was about to begin, and with it would come the maneuver that Montgomery had always intended, the encirclement and destruction of German forces in Normandy. The months of criticism about caution and slowness would soon give way to recognition that the patient accumulation of strength, the grinding attrition of German reserves, and the disciplined adherence to a long-term plan had created the conditions for decisive victory. Montgomery had endured the impatience of his allies, the criticism of the press, and the questioning of his judgment, and he had prevailed through the application of systematic thinking and absolute confidence in his method. The lodgment was secure, and from this position of strength, the Allies would break out and drive toward the encirclement at Falaise that would change the character of the campaign forever. By the middle of August in 1944, the world of Normandy had transformed from a beachhead into a sprawling battlefront. Montgomery's patient strategy during the 2 months following D-Day had worked precisely as he had designed it. The British and Canadian forces, anchored around the city of Caen, had absorbed the full weight of German panzer counterattacks, while American forces under General Omar Bradley consolidated their positions and built the logistical foundation for a breakout. Now, as August advanced and the weather held clear, the moment for decisive maneuver had arrived. German forces, battered and depleted but still dangerous, occupied a narrowing corridor between the American advance from the west and the British and Canadian drive from the north. What happened in the next 10 days would determine whether the entire German army in Normandy escaped to fight again, or whether it would be destroyed in place. Montgomery saw the opportunity and moved to seize it. The concept was elegant in its simplicity, though terrifyingly complex in execution. American forces advancing from the south under General Bradley would drive toward the town of Alençon, pushing eastward with aggressive speed. Simultaneously, Canadian forces under General Henry Crerard, fighting north of Caen, and British forces would drive south and east toward the town of Falaise, moving to meet the American thrust and create a barrier that the Germans could not cross. If the two forces linked successfully and rapidly, German armies would find themselves in a rapidly contracting pocket with no escape route. Supplies would dwindle, communication would deteriorate, and organized resistance would collapse. German generals knew this as well as Montgomery did. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding German forces in the west, began withdrawing units eastward to escape the closing trap, but his movements were slow, hampered by Allied air superiority and the exhaustion of his forces. The race was on, and everything depended on speed and coordination between forces that had never truly fought as seamlessly integrated partners. The American 7th Corps and 1st Army divisions drove toward Alençon with determined aggression in the scorching heat of midsummer. General George Patton, commanding the newly activated 3rd Army, chafed at any suggestion of caution and pushed his divisions hard across the Norman bocage, the dense hedgerow country that had frustrated movement for weeks. American soldiers, younger and fresher than their German opponents, advanced rapidly against diminishing resistance. They reached Alençon on August 11th, having driven against weakening German opposition and covered ground at a pace that exceeded Montgomery's expectations. Reports of the American advance raced back to Montgomery's headquarters, and the plan began to accelerate. The British and Canadians, now driving south from the Caen area, would close the pocket from the north. Success appeared within reach. Yet as American forces pushed beyond Alençon toward Argenton, where German forces were attempting to establish a defensive line, something unexpected happened. The American advance began to slow. Orders came down to halt the American northward drive, preventing them from advancing further toward Falaise and closing the pocket entirely. The halt at Argentan became one of the most controversial decisions of the Normandy campaign, a decision whose consequences would echo for decades in military histories and generals' memoirs. American commanders on the ground, aggressive, impatient generals like Patton and Omar Bradley himself, wanted to continue driving north, to push into Falaise and seal the trap from below. Montgomery, however, believed that further American advance into territory that had not been cleared of German forces might create confusion and friendly fire incidents. He also believed that the Canadian forces, driving south toward Falaise, would close the pocket from the north. Therefore, in his judgment, American forces should hold their ground at Argentan and consolidate their positions, rather than risk overextending and creating a gap through which German forces might pour. American commanders bristled at the order. Patton, in particular, felt that the order represented a failure of nerve, a missed opportunity to annihilate the German army entirely. Yet the order held. American forces dug in and waited for the Canadians to arrive. The argument over whether this decision was cautious wisdom or catastrophic hesitation would never be fully resolved. North of the pocket, the Canadian and Polish forces drove toward Falaise with courage, but at a pace that reflected the intensity of German resistance in their sector. Canadian soldiers, many of them in their first major operation, pressed forward against determined German opposition. Polish forces fighting with the Canadians carried not only the weight of current battle, but the accumulated rage of a nation occupied and subjugated for 5 years. The Germans, aware that Falaise represented their last chance to escape the tightening noose, fought with ferocity. Anti-tank guns and infantry with Panzerfausts contested every hedgerow and every village. The Canadian advance slowed to the agonizing pace of brutal attritional combat. Days passed. The gap between the American forces waiting at Argentan and the Canadian forces struggling south toward Falaise remained open. Reports came back to Montgomery that the Canadians would not reach Falaise as quickly as he had hoped. German columns, sensing the remaining window of escape, began moving eastward faster. What had appeared to be a trap with closing jaws now seemed to be a trap with one side slightly open, and German forces were pouring through. Desperation drove both commanders and soldiers to push harder, but desperation and courage cannot always overcome the physical limits of exhausted men and depleted supplies. On August 15th, Montgomery issued new orders designed to accelerate the encirclement. American forces would now drive northeastward from Alençon toward Argentan and beyond, rather than holding their position. Simultaneously, Canadian and Polish forces would press harder toward Falaise. The emphasis shifted toward speed rather than perfect coordination. This was Montgomery at his most practical, adapting his plan to reality rather than clinging to it. Yet the very urgency that now animated the commanders had the unintended effect of creating confusion. Communication between American and Canadian forces, never seamless, became strained. Reports of positions contradicted other reports. Nobody was entirely certain of where friendly forces were located, and in that uncertainty, opportunities arose for both Germans and for terrible mistakes. German columns of vehicles and troops, some organized and combat-ready, others scattered and desperate, pressed eastward through the remaining gaps. Dust rose from the roads in the hot August sun. The sounds of exploding shells and the screams of wounded men filled the Norman air. The pocket was shrinking, but it was not closed. By August 16th and 17th, the Germans recognized that they could not hold their defensive line much longer. Von Kluge issued orders for a fighting withdrawal eastward, abandoning the attempt to hold Normandy and beginning the long retreat that would eventually end in Germany's defeat. Thousands of German soldiers, their vehicles, their wounded, and their equipment began moving through the narrowing corridor. The roads eastward from Falaise became jammed with traffic, creating an irresistible target for Allied fighter bombers that now roamed the skies nearly unopposed. Typhoons and P-47s attacked the columns with cannon fire, leaving vehicles burning and roads choked with the detritus of retreating armies. Yet despite the destruction from above and the closing of the pocket around them, many German soldiers continued to escape. Some units fought their way through the remaining gaps. Others abandoned their vehicles and equipment and moved on foot through the bocage, slipping past American and Canadian lines under cover of darkness and rain. The numbers of those who escaped would become a point of bitter contention. How many Germans left the pocket? Was it thousands or tens of thousands? The answer mattered because it bore directly on the question of whether Falaise represented a decisive victory or a costly but incomplete operation. Montgomery's plan for a perfect encirclement had not succeeded. This reality was difficult for him to accept. A man whose reputation rested on methodical planning and the systematic destruction of enemies through overwhelming force applied with precision. He had assumed that American and Canadian forces would move with perfect coordination and maintain a steady pace. He had not fully accounted for the ferocity of German resistance or the capacity of German officers like von Kluge to adapt quickly and organize fighting retreats under pressure. He had not anticipated that communication failures and the fog of war would create gaps between subordinate commanders. Yet even as the pocket failed to close completely, the operation succeeded in its broader strategic purpose. German forces in Normandy, though not entirely destroyed, had been catastrophically damaged. Tanks, artillery, vehicles, and supplies lay abandoned or burning across the Norman landscape. Tens of thousands of German soldiers became prisoners of war. Most crucially, the German army's capability to conduct organized resistance in Normandy had ceased to exist. The retreat eastward became a rout, a flight toward the Seine and beyond, toward the German frontier. The period from August 18th to August 25th witnessed the final collapse of German resistance in Normandy. American forces pressed eastward and northeastward. British and Canadian forces drove south and east toward the Seine. German forces, their command structure fragmenting and their supply lines cut, disintegrated into smaller units fighting isolated battles or dissolving entirely. Some German officers, recognizing the hopelessness of continued resistance, surrendered their commands rather than sacrifice their men for a cause already lost. Others fought to the bitter end, clinging to the belief that somewhere reinforcements would arrive or a new defensive line could be held. They never came. The reinforcements Montgomery had feared from Germany, the panzer divisions that might have restored balance to the campaign, never materialized. By August 25th, Paris was liberated. By August 30th, German forces had been driven back across the Seine. Normandy belonged entirely to the Allies. The beachhead that on June 6th had seemed impossibly vulnerable had transformed into a consolidated front from which further offensives into France and eventually into Germany would be launched. The question of why the Falaise pocket remained partially open haunted post-war military discussions for decades. American commanders blamed Montgomery for ordering them to halt at Argentan. Montgomery blamed American commanders for not breaking through toward Falaise when they had the opportunity. Historians have identified communication failures, the unexpected resilience of German resistance, and the simple fact that the terrain and the pace of modern warfare made perfect coordination nearly impossible even among forces on the same side. What was certain was that the pocket, though incomplete, achieved more than enough to vindicate Montgomery's broader strategy. His insistence on methodical preparation, on overwhelming force, and on consolidating gains before attempting further advances had worked. The deliberate approach to warfare that American commanders had sometimes criticized as overly cautious had defeated the more aggressive tactics and the German military machine that had dominated Europe for 4 years. The liberation of France, which followed swiftly from the collapse of German forces in Normandy, vindicated Montgomery's judgment in the strategic debate that had consumed the command hierarchy since early 1944. He had been proven right. Overwhelming force, careful coordination, and patient consolidation of gains defeated the Germans more effectively than rapid exploitation or risky maneuvers. Yet the cost had been genuine. Thousands of soldiers from Britain, Canada, Poland, and America lay dead or wounded in the fields and towns of Normandy. German prisoners filled camps by the hundreds of thousands. The victory was real, but it had been hard won, contested by an enemy that, though ultimately defeated, had fought with skill and desperation until the very end. As Montgomery gazed across the Norman landscape in the final days of August, he could see the proof of his strategy in the destroyed German columns, the captured weapons, and the liberated civilians beginning to emerge from hiding. The pocket at Falaise had not been a perfect encirclement, but it had been close enough, and it had been enough. By the autumn of 1944, Bernard Montgomery faced a predicament that no amount of military brilliance could fully resolve. The German army in France had been shattered at Falaise. Paris had fallen. The British and American armies were advancing toward the Rhine with a speed that seemed to promise the war might end before winter closed the campaign. Yet in this moment of triumph, a fundamental disagreement emerged between the man who had orchestrated the Normandy landings and the supreme commander who now held ultimate authority over all Allied forces. Dwight Eisenhower had assumed operational control of the ground campaign on the 1st of September 1944, and almost immediately, Montgomery began to argue with ferocity that the American conception of warfare was wasteful, diffuse, and strategically unsound. The Allies, Montgomery insisted, were throwing away their advantage through scattered effort. What they required instead was a concentrated blow, a single, overwhelming thrust toward Berlin, where the heart of Nazi Germany could be punctured before winter set in. The irony was bitter. The man who had become famous for methodical, attritional warfare now found himself arguing for audacious concentration of force against officers who favored the very broad front strategy that he had long condemned as unfocused. The roots of this disagreement lay in fundamentally different conceptions of warfare and of military leadership. Eisenhower had never been a field commander at the scale of a massive army in continuous combat. His career had been shaped by staff work, diplomacy, and the delicate management of a coalition. He understood war as a collaborative enterprise in which American resources would eventually overwhelm any enemy through sheer weight of numbers. If the entire Allied line pressed forward simultaneously, German forces would be forced to spread their defenses so thinly that they would collapse under pressure everywhere at once. This broad front strategy offered political advantages as well. It distributed the prestige of advance across both British and American sectors, satisfied multiple commanders, and avoided the appearance that Eisenhower was subordinating American armies to British direction. Montgomery, by contrast, had always believed that the essence of warfare was concentration. A general must identify the decisive point, mass overwhelming force at that location, and break the enemy at that point. Everything else became secondary. To diffuse effort across a wide front was to guarantee that nowhere would force be decisive, and that resources would be squandered in thousand small, indecisive battles. Furthermore, Montgomery understood himself as the superior tactician and strategist, and he suspected that Eisenhower, however genial and politically skilled, lacked the intellectual clarity and ruthless single-mindedness that great warfare demanded. The disagreement was not merely tactical. It was a clash between two men with irreconcilable views of what military leadership required. As autumn began, Montgomery set forth his vision with characteristic force and specificity. He insisted that the Allies must concentrate their resources on a single thrust in the north, under his direct command, that would cross the Rhine, sweep through northern Germany, and strike toward Berlin and the Baltic ports. This northern route, Montgomery argued, offered several decisive advantages. It passed through relatively open terrain. It would outflank German defensive lines. It offered the prospect of cutting off German forces retreating from the south, and it placed British forces in the role they deserved, the spearhead of the final victory. The American forces would provide supporting operations in the south, clearing their sector and protecting the flank of the main thrust. It was a strategy that reflected Montgomery's entire philosophy: clear objective, concentrated force, subordination of secondary operations to the primary aim, and above all, the elimination of waste and dispersion. He presented this proposal repeatedly, in meetings and in written memoranda, with a confidence that bordered on certainty. He was not asking for Eisenhower's approval. He was explaining what must happen. His tone, refined by years of success and vindicated by his victories, conveyed an almost serene conviction that any general who understood warfare would naturally see the sense of his position. But Eisenhower disagreed, and behind Eisenhower stood the political weight of American power. The American perspective was not without merit, even if Montgomery could not fully acknowledge it. The United States had poured more men and material into the war than any other nation. American factories produced tanks, trucks, artillery, and ammunition in quantities that seemed almost limitless. It was psychologically and politically impossible for American commanders to accept a strategy that relegated the American army to a secondary role, even if that role was essential. American generals had their own ambitions and their own belief that American armies could accomplish the objectives assigned to them. Omar Bradley, who commanded American Army Group, was respected by Eisenhower in a way that Montgomery was not. Bradley was cooperative, collegial, and willing to work within Eisenhower's framework rather than challenging it fundamentally. If Eisenhower adopted Montgomery's strategy, he would be saying to American commanders that their armies were supporting actors in a British-directed drama. The political cost within the American military would be severe. Moreover, Eisenhower worried about the strategic risks of concentrating force so heavily in the north, while leaving the southern flank exposed. If the Germans mounted a counterattack in the American sector, or if the northern thrust became overextended, the entire enterprise could be jeopardized. Eisenhower's broad front strategy accepted some inefficiency in the interest of security and balance. It was in this context that Montgomery proposed Operation Market Garden, a plan that reflected both his vision of concentrated force and his conviction that he alone possessed the clarity of thought to conceive and execute truly bold operations. The plan called for 3 British and American airborne divisions to be dropped behind German lines in the Netherlands, seizing a corridor of bridges stretching roughly 80 kilometers from Eindhoven northward to Arnhem. This airborne assault would be followed by rapid advance of ground forces along the liberated corridor, crossing the Rhine and outflanking the German defensive line. If successful, the operation would create the opening for the main thrust toward Berlin. If it failed, the losses would be enormous, and the prestige of airborne operations and of Montgomery would suffer damage. Yet Montgomery was convinced that it would succeed. He believed that German forces in the Netherlands were depleted and incapable of serious resistance. He believed that his meticulous planning and overwhelming coordination would overcome the risks. He believed that boldness at this moment could shorten the war by months, saving hundreds of thousands of lives. He presented the plan to Eisenhower with all his characteristic certainty, and Eisenhower, despite reservations, approved it. It was a decision that would define the final act of their partnership. As the campaign unfolded through September and into October, the grand strategy conflict became intertwined with the specific battles Montgomery fought. The airborne operation at Arnhem, meant to demonstrate the power of concentration and bold execution, instead revealed the costs of overextension and the limits of meticulous planning when the enemy declined to cooperate. The operation succeeded partially. The southern portion of the bridge corridor was captured and held, but the northern element failed, and the British 1st Airborne Division suffered catastrophic losses in the attempt to hold Arnhem. The momentum that Montgomery had believed was inevitable slowed instead to a crawl. The Rhine was not crossed in September, as he had promised. Berlin remained unreachably distant. Yet even as Market Garden unfolded, Eisenhower was making clear his decision about grand strategy. The broad front advance would continue. American forces would press forward across their sector. Montgomery would command the northern sector, but he would not command the overall operation, and his northern thrust would not receive the overwhelming concentration of resources that he demanded. Eisenhower had chosen cooperation and balance over the risks of concentrated force under a single aggressive commander. The implications were clear. British influence on the conduct of the war was declining, and American weight was dominant. The psychological impact on Montgomery was profound, though he never openly acknowledged it. He had survived the war as the one British general with a truly international reputation. He had defeated Rommel when Britain stood nearly alone against Hitler. He had planned the Normandy landings. He had brought order to the chaos of that campaign. And now, when he sought to impress his vision of how the war should be concluded, he was overruled by a commander he regarded as intellectually his inferior and by American officers whose strategy he despised. The frustration was barely contained beneath his professional demeanor. He continued to advocate for concentration, to argue that the broad front strategy was wasteful, and to insist that he possessed the clarity of vision to see the path to victory. But he was increasingly ignored. Eisenhower listened politely, acknowledged his points, and then pursued his own course. This was perhaps the cruelest aspect of alliance warfare, that a general of enormous ability and achievement could be overruled not because his judgment was wrong, but because the political and material power of his allies was greater than his own. Montgomery understood this, and it embittered him. He would later claim that victory had been delayed, lives had been wasted, and the war had been prolonged because his vision was rejected. He would defend Market Garden not as a failure of his own judgment, but as a demonstration of what might have been achieved if his strategic vision had been accepted. He would look back on this period as the moment when the British Army's voice in the Allied councils was effectively silenced, and when American materialism and lack of strategic sophistication became the dominant force shaping the war's conclusion. Yet the question of who was right remains ambiguous and historically contested. Some military analysts have argued that Montgomery's concentration strategy could in fact have shortened the war, that the Rhine might have been crossed in 1944, and that German forces might have been decisively broken before they could recover and launch the Ardennes offensive. Others have contended that Eisenhower's caution was justified, that overextension risked catastrophic defeat, and that the broad front strategy, though apparently wasteful, provided the security necessary to sustain the massive logistical effort required for final victory. The truth is likely that both men saw certain aspects of the military situation clearly and were blind to others. Montgomery understood the value of concentration and the dangers of diffusion, but he perhaps underestimated the difficulty of sustaining an operation so far from supply bases and the vulnerability of a thin spearhead to German counterattack. Eisenhower understood the political necessity of not appearing to subordinate American forces to British command and the value of advancing on a broad front, but he may have been excessively cautious in rejecting a strategy that could have offered decisive results. The disagreement was not merely about tactics, but about the fundamental nature of warfare itself, whether victory came through concentration and the crushing blow, or through patient accumulation of advantage and the pressure applied everywhere simultaneously. What is certain is that by the winter of 1944, Montgomery's authority within the Allied command structure had been substantially diminished. When the German Ardennes offensive erupted in December, it was to some degree because American strategy had left the northern sector of the Ardennes thinly held. Montgomery, coordinating the response to this crisis, would partially rehabilitate his standing through cool judgment and effective action, but the broader strategic control of the war was increasingly in American hands. The Rhine would be crossed, but under Eisenhower's overall command and with forces deployed in a manner that did not follow Montgomery's recommendations. The final advance into Germany would come, but not as the concentrated thrust toward Berlin that Montgomery had envisioned. Instead, it would be the measured, broad-front advance that Eisenhower preferred, in which American armies played equal roles with British forces and sometimes surpassed them in the race toward the final objectives. The war would end with Germany divided not among the victors, but with Soviet forces occupying the eastern territories and British and American forces holding the western zones. Montgomery would emerge from this conflict with his reputation intact, but his influence over the war's conclusion minimized. He had learned, in these difficult months, that being right was not the same as being in command, and that military brilliance could be overruled by political necessity and the weight of material power. It was a bitter lesson, but one that would shape his subsequent career and his understanding of what military leadership could and could not achieve in a modern age. By the autumn of 1944, Bernard Montgomery stood at the pinnacle of his military authority. The victories of Normandy and the breakout from the beachhead had confirmed his reputation as a strategist of unwavering nerve and meticulous preparation. Yet his position within the Allied command structure had begun to shift in ways that troubled him deeply. The Americans, whose industrial might and manpower had grown throughout the war, increasingly questioned his cautious approach to warfare. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander, favored a broad advance across the entire German frontier, spreading resources to maintain pressure along all fronts. Montgomery, by contrast, believed that concentration of force under a unified command, his command, offered the only means to strike decisively at the heart of Nazi Germany before winter set in. The tension between these two visions of how to end the war would soon become the crucible in which Montgomery's judgment would be tested and found, by many, wanting. The genesis of Operation Market Garden lay in Montgomery's conviction that the Germans were broken, their armies shattered, their will to resist collapsing under the weight of successive defeats. In mid-September, with his forces poised along the Belgian and Dutch borders, Montgomery proposed an operation of stunning audacity, a coordinated airborne and ground assault aimed at seizing a chain of river crossings leading to the Rhine itself. 3 divisions of American and British airborne troops would land behind German lines to capture bridges across the Maas, the Waal, and the Niederrhein. Simultaneously, the British Second Army, under Montgomery's direct command, would punch northward from the Belgian border, linking up with the airborne forces and driving toward Arnhem, where the final and most important crossing awaited. If successful, the operation would outflank the Siegfried Line, the German defensive fortification stretching across their western frontier, and open a direct route into the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. Montgomery presented the plan as a war-winning stroke, one that required only the audacity to seize the moment when German resistance hung by a thread. Eisenhower, under considerable pressure from American commanders to demonstrate forward momentum and unwilling to override his British subordinate entirely, approved the operation on the 4th of September, albeit with evident reservations. Intelligence reports suggested that German strength in the area was greater than Montgomery's assessment acknowledged. Photographs from reconnaissance aircraft indicated the presence of panzer units near Arnhem, though their exact location and operational status remained unclear. American intelligence officers, in particular, worried that the plan underestimated German recovery capacity and overestimated the speed with which ground forces could advance northward to relieve the airborne troops. These concerns were voiced, documented, and then set aside in the momentum toward execution. Montgomery, by contrast, displayed absolute confidence in the operation's success, a confidence that proved infectious among his staff and the commanders of the airborne forces assigned to the operation. The very boldness of the plan, the scope of its ambition, seemed to Montgomery to be the guarantee of its success. The Germans simply could not move reinforcements quickly enough to prevent the seizure of the Rhine crossings. On the 17th of September, at 0630 hours, the first wave of American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division descended into the skies above southern Holland. Minutes later, the 82nd Airborne began its own insertion. British and Polish airborne forces followed in waves throughout the morning, an armada of transport aircraft protected by swarms of fighters dropping the largest airborne force yet assembled in a single operation. The sight was awe-inspiring and, in its way, almost unreal. Thousands of parachutes blossoming against the sky, men descending into what they expected to be a shattered and demoralized enemy. The landings themselves went largely as planned. The Americans secured their objectives at Eindhoven and Nijmegen despite scattered German opposition. The British 1st Airborne Corps, under General Frederick Browning, landed north of the Niederrhein, with the primary objective of capturing and holding the bridge at Arnhem until the ground forces arrived. Everything depended, as Montgomery had calculated, on the speed of the ground advance and the weakness of German response. But from the first hours of the operation, reality began to deviate from Montgomery's careful calculations in ways that no plan, however detailed, could accommodate. The German commander in the Arnhem sector, General Kurt Student, reacted with surprising speed and tactical sophistication. More significantly, the elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which intelligence had placed at some distance from the area, were in fact positioned close enough to begin immediate counterattacks. The commander of the British Airborne Force, General Roy Urquhart, found his forces scattered across a wider area than anticipated, with communications equipment damaged and the majority of his troops unable to reach the bridge at Arnhem on the first day. The Germans, operating on interior lines and with superior local mobility, began to contain and then squeeze the British airborne perimeter with a methodical ferocity that bore all the hallmarks of experienced Wehrmacht soldiers fighting for survival. The bold assumption that German resistance would be minimal or ineffective proved catastrophically wrong. Meanwhile, the British ground forces, advancing northward from Belgium, encountered resistance that was far from negligible. The supposedly broken German army fought with stubborn determination at every canal crossing, every village, every prepared position. The 101st Airborne at Eindhoven was relieved on time, and the 82nd managed to hold on at Nijmegen despite heavy fighting. But as the British Second Army drove northward to relieve the 1st Airborne at Arnhem, the pace of advance slowed dramatically. Supply lines stretched thin. German forces, though outnumbered and increasingly desperate, conducted an effective delaying campaign. The American airborne forces, having secured their bridges, found themselves unable to move forward aggressively without risking encirclement. They held their positions and waited for the ground forces to reach them. But those ground forces were struggling to move fast enough. The narrow roads of Holland, the many water obstacles, the dense German resistance, all combined to create a tempo of advance that fell further and further behind the demands of the timetable that Montgomery's plan had assumed. For 3 days, the British airborne at Arnhem fought with extraordinary bravery in conditions of increasing desperation. Their drop zones and landing areas had been widely scattered. Units were unable to consolidate. The majority of the force never reached the bridge itself. Those who did, under the command of Major John Frost, held a small perimeter on the northern bank of the Niederrhein with dwindling ammunition and mounting casualties. German forces, operating in the urban terrain of Arnhem with superior numbers and armor support, gradually compressed the British positions. Urquhart, himself cut off from most of his command for much of the battle, could do little except try to maintain order and coordinate the remnants of his scattered forces. Radio communications were sporadic. Runners had to move through streets under sniper fire to carry messages. The situation, which had appeared so promising on the first day, deteriorated with each passing hour. Montgomery, receiving increasingly fragmentary reports at his headquarters, maintained his conviction that the operation would succeed if only the ground forces could accelerate their northward advance. But the ground forces were reaching the limit of what momentum and determination could achieve. As the Germans reinforced the Arnhem sector and German resistance stiffened, it became apparent to commanders on the ground that the speed of advance essential to the operation's success could not be maintained. German counterattacks threatened to cut off the American forces at Nijmegen and Eindhoven from each other. Supplies were running short. Casualties were mounting. On the 20th of September, 3 days after the initial landings, it became clear to senior commanders that the British airborne force at Arnhem could not be relieved in time to hold the bridge. The question then became whether the 1st Airborne could be withdrawn or whether it would be forced to surrender. Montgomery's response was to insist that the operation continue, that the ground forces press on, that somehow the position could be stabilized and the airborne relieved. Yet even as these orders were issued, the bitter reality was becoming undeniable. Operation Market Garden would not achieve its strategic objective. Over the next 2 days, in conditions of chaos and desperation, the remnants of the British airborne force attempted to withdraw across the Niederrhein. Boats were few. The Germans maintained heavy fire across the river. Many who attempted to cross were killed in the water. Approximately 7,800 British and Polish airborne soldiers became prisoners of war. The survivors, those who made it back across the river or who escaped eastward into territory controlled by Dutch resistance fighters, were fewer than half the force that had landed. The cost in lives was staggering. The cost in morale and confidence in Montgomery's judgment was, in some quarters, catastrophic. The ground forces, after driving northward with incredible effort and sacrifice, came to rest short of achieving complete victory in the operation, having suffered more than 14,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, in a campaign that had lasted 9 days. In the aftermath, the blame was distributed unevenly. Some held that Montgomery's plan was fundamentally sound, but that execution had been hampered by factors beyond his control. German strength was greater than expected. Ground forces were slower than anticipated. Luck and chance intervened as they always do in warfare. Others argued that Montgomery, in his confidence and in his determination to force through a plan that reflected his strategic vision, had ignored intelligence warnings and overestimated the collapse of German resistance. The operation was neither unqualified success nor complete failure, but rather a painful demonstration that even the most careful planning could be undone by the friction of war and the unpredictable behavior of an enemy fighting for national survival. Montgomery's reputation, though surely not destroyed, he remained a formidable figure and a major commander, never quite recovered its earlier luster. The aura of infallibility had been tarnished. Senior American commanders, noting that many of their doubts about the operation had been vindicated, began to push more aggressively for the broad front strategy that Eisenhower favored, reducing the weight Montgomery's voice would carry in the months ahead. The question of what might have been, whether a different plan, a different command structure, A different distribution of resources might have achieved success where Market Garden had failed, would haunt Montgomery for the rest of his life. In later interviews and memoirs, he defended the operation with characteristic obstinacy, arguing that it had been sound in conception and that its failure represented not faulty planning, but rather the inherent uncertainty of warfare. Yet the fact remained that his prestige had been diminished, his judgment questioned, and his strategic authority within the Allied command diluted by the costly withdrawal from Arnhem. The bridge across the Rhine remained in German hands. The Siegfried Line would have to be breached through direct assault rather than outflanking maneuver. The winter ahead would bring grinding, attritional warfare of the sort that Montgomery had always resisted, the very thing his carefully calculated plans had been designed to avoid. For a commander whose entire philosophy rested on the substitution of careful preparation and overwhelming material superiority for the chaos and waste of conventional combat, the conclusion was deeply uncomfortable. Sometimes, despite all the planning and preparation, the enemy simply fought better, moved faster, and refused to cooperate with the timetable into which you had attempted to fit them. The winter of 1944 descended on Europe with merciless cold. By December, the Allied advance had slowed. Supplies stretched thin across newly liberated territories. The Germans, in their desperation, were planning something audacious: a massive counterattack through the Ardennes forest, a sector they calculated the Allies held lightly, defended by inexperienced divisions and exhausted troops. Montgomery, now a field marshal, commanding the 21st Army Group in the north, had sensed something was amiss in the intelligence reports. The Germans possessed reserves. They possessed intent. Yet the American First Army commander, General Omar Bradley, felt secure. The Ardennes, he believed, was a quiet sector. On the 16th of December, in the gray pre-dawn, German artillery erupted across a front of 120 kilometers. Operation Autumn Mist, the Wehrmacht's last gamble, had begun. It would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The initial German penetration was swift and devastating. The 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel crashed through American lines like water finding cracks in stone. Entire battalions were surrounded or scattered. The weather grounded Allied air support. The one advantage that had sustained the American advantage for months evaporated beneath thick clouds and snow. Communication networks fractured. Confusion reigned in American headquarters. Some units fought with extraordinary courage. Others broke or surrendered. By the morning of the 17th of December, the true scale of the German offensive was becoming apparent, and American commanders recognized that their forces were in genuine peril. General Bradley, whose headquarters sat at Luxembourg, found himself unable to command his northern forces effectively. The German penetration had created a bulge in the line that split his army. Bradley looked at the map and made the decision that would define the next phase of the campaign. He telephoned Field Marshal Montgomery and requested his help in stabilizing the northern sector. For a man of Montgomery's pride, his insistence on method, and his history of friction with American commanders, this moment represented both a test and an opportunity. Montgomery received the call with characteristic composure. Bradley was asking whether the 21st Army Group could assume command of the American First Army's northern flank and help contain the German advance. It was an extraordinary request, putting a British commander over American troops in the midst of a crisis. Yet Bradley understood the reality of the situation. The northern American forces were now operationally separated from their southern counterparts by the German advance. Coordinating from Luxembourg was impossible. Montgomery, whatever his faults, was systematic, calm under pressure, and expert at coordinating large forces in fluid situations. What is sometimes forgotten in the mythology surrounding this moment is that Montgomery did not hesitate. He did not demand concessions or make the request a point of negotiation. Within hours, he had crossed from his headquarters and taken command of the American First Army and Ninth Army, integrating them into his operational framework. His staff, trained in his methods, arrived to establish coordinating centers and communications networks. This was what Montgomery did best. arrive at chaos and impose order through sheer force of will and organizational clarity. The German offensive, brilliant in its initial conception, began to lose momentum almost immediately, though neither the Germans nor the Americans fully understood this at first. The German plan required speed, a rapid thrust westward to seize bridges across the Meuse River and ultimately to capture Antwerp, the great port that was supplying the Allied armies. But the American defense, though initially broken, began to stiffen. Small garrisons held key towns. Engineers blew bridges. Tank destroyer units appeared unexpectedly. The weather, which had initially favored the Germans by preventing air support, gradually cleared. As Montgomery took command of the northern sector, he made a series of decisions that reflected his fundamental approach to warfare. He would not attempt to immediately counterattack or reverse the German thrust through desperate action. Instead, he would consolidate the northern flank, seal the breach, and ensure that no further German penetration was possible. Only then, with secure positions and overwhelming force gathered, would he coordinate a counteroffensive. To American officers accustomed to the doctrine of rapid movement and aggressive exploitation, this seemed slow. Yet it was precisely this refusal to panic or act hastily that gave the American forces time to stabilize and eventually triumph. Montgomery's first act was to visit the front lines personally. He arrived at First Army headquarters with his characteristic entourage, his physical appearance, the beret, the air of absolute certainty, both reassuring and, to some, infuriating in its confidence, at a moment when the situation remained grave. American officers noted that he seemed unperturbed by reports of German advances. He asked precise questions about unit dispositions, supply lines, and the location of reserves. He established a clear command structure. He appointed General Courtney Hodges, the First Army commander, to remain in tactical control of the armies under his overall strategic direction. This delegation of authority, while maintaining oversight, was crucial. Montgomery understood that removing an American commander would demoralize the troops and create political complications. He was being, in his own way, politically astute. The American soldiers and officers, he recognized, needed confidence in their own leadership. What they required from him was clarity of strategic direction and coordination, the big picture. He would provide that. He would not micromanage the tactical battle. The consolidation of the northern sector proceeded methodically over the following days. Montgomery's staff coordinated the arrival of British reserves from the 21st Army Group, positioning them to backstop American positions and provide a secure flank if the Germans achieved further breakthrough. He ensured that ammunition and fuel supplies were directed toward the critical sectors. He organized counterattacking forces, British and American units operating under unified command, positioned to strike the German flank as soon as the opportunity presented itself. American commanders, even those who found Montgomery's manner grating, began to recognize what was happening. The chaos was being transformed into structure. The panic was being replaced with purpose. Most crucially, the threat that had seemed existential on the 16th of December was being, through clear-eyed assessment and methodical action, neutralized. The German offensive, which had achieved a maximum penetration of roughly 110 kilometers westward, began to slow, then to freeze, then to reverse. The critical moment came when the weather cleared. Allied air forces, particularly the American 8th Air Force and Tactical Air Command, launched themselves upon the German columns and concentrations. From the 20th of December onward, German armor and infantry moving through the snow-covered landscape were visible to every fighter-bomber and ground attack aircraft in the sky. The interdiction campaign was devastating. German losses mounted. Fuel shortages began to cripple their mobility. Montgomery, coordinating from his headquarters, saw the moment approaching when the German momentum was genuinely broken. He coordinated with General Bradley and the American commanders to prepare the counterattack. The strategy was to contain the Germans from the north, which Montgomery's forces were accomplishing, while the American Third Army under General George Patton wheeled northward to strike the southern face of the German penetration. The goal was encirclement, to repeat the formula that had worked at Falaise 4 months earlier. What distinguished Montgomery's performance during this crisis was not tactical brilliance. The actual fighting was conducted by American officers and soldiers, but rather strategic vision and operational calm. He recognized that the German offensive, though initially devastating, could not succeed once it lost the initiative. His role was to buy time for American reinforcements to arrive and consolidate, to prevent any further erosion of the northern flank, and to set conditions for a coordinated counteroffensive that would not merely repel the Germans, but destroy their ability to wage offensive warfare in the West. This required resisting the temptation to counterattack prematurely, before forces were ready. It required refusing to panic or accept the inevitability of German success, which had been the reality on the 17th of December, but was no longer true by the 20th. Montgomery understood this distinction. He had lived through the early chaos of the Western campaign, the near disaster in Normandy, and the disappointment of Arnhem. He knew the difference between tactical crisis and strategic disaster. This was a tactical crisis that could be mastered through discipline and clear thinking. The American counterattack from the south, led by Patton's Third Army, began on the 22nd of December. Patton wheeled his forces with remarkable speed, and they struck the southern flank of the German advance. Montgomery's forces, pressed from the north, coordinated their operations with Patton's northward thrust. The plan was to meet somewhere in the area of Bastogne and seal the German penetration. Weather continued to improve, and air superiority became overwhelming. German divisions, lacking fuel and ammunition, found themselves caught between converging armies with superior numbers, firepower, and air support. The encirclement never quite achieved the dramatic closure that Falaise had witnessed 4 months earlier. Some German forces managed to withdraw rather than surrender, but the strategic effect was clear. The German offensive had failed. The Wehrmacht had committed its last reserves to a gamble and lost. By the end of December, the Bulge was in the process of being eliminated. By the middle of January, German forces were in full retreat. Montgomery's role in the Battle of the Bulge has been the subject of considerable historical debate and American criticism. Some American officers claimed that he tried to take excessive credit for a victory that was essentially American in character. Some suggested that his caution allowed German forces to escape that might have been destroyed with more aggressive action. Others noted that his public statements about the battle created the impression that American forces had been incompetent and British command had saved them, an assertion that American officers, then and now, found deeply offensive. These criticisms contain kernels of truth. Montgomery was not modest about his achievements. He did view the Bulge as vindication of his methods against what he saw as American overconfidence and insufficient coordination. His public commentary, particularly at a press conference where he described the situation in ways that American commanders felt misrepresented their efforts, created lasting resentment. Yet the historical record also shows that Montgomery's intervention was crucial at a specific moment, that his refusal to panic prevented further deterioration of the military situation, and that his coordination of forces, particularly the integration of British reserves and the careful orchestration of the northern containment, demonstrated precisely why military command requires calm judgment when the situation is most desperate. The deeper significance of Montgomery's performance during the Bulge was psychological and strategic rather than tactical. For months, American commanders had been resisting what they regarded as British cautishness